When a janitor spoke perfect Japanese to a silent CEO, he had no idea it would change 3 lives forever. The Royal Grand Hotel's marble lobby had seen its share of drama, but nothing quite like this. A powerful Japanese CEO stood frozen at the reception desk, her silence creating chaos that would soon reveal the extraordinary story of connection loss and unexpected love waiting to unfold. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. Part 1. The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the Royal Grand Hotel's pristine marble floor as Elliot Barnes pushed his mop bucket through the shadows of the opulent lobby. At 42, he had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through spaces where million-dollar deals were struck, and celebrities sipped champagne yet remaining as unnoticed as the air itself. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 3 years of single fatherhood and countless nights of grief. The early morning shift was his sanctuary. Before the chaos of check-ins and business meetings, before the symphony of ringing phones and clicking heels, there was just him and the silence that had become his closest companion. He understood silence in ways most people never would, had learned its language through necessity, through loss, through watching his 7-year-old daughter Charlotte retreat into her own wordless world after her mother's death. But this particular Tuesday morning silence would prove to be anything but peaceful. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that without proper documentation, I cannot—" Veronica Hale's voice cut through the lobby's tranquil atmosphere like a blade through silk. The hotel manager's perfectly coiffed blonde hair trembled with barely contained frustration as she stood behind the mahogany reception desk, her manicured fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the leather-bound guest registry. Elliot paused his mopping, instinctively glancing toward the commotion. At the center of the storm stood a woman who commanded attention without uttering a single word. Raina Saito, though Elliot didn't yet know her name, possessed the kind of presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around her. Her charcoal business suit was cut with mathematical precision, her black hair pulled into a flawless chignon that spoke of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. But it was her eyes that caught Elliot's attention, dark pools of intelligence that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. She remained perfectly still, her silence creating ripples of confusion that spread outward like stones thrown into still water. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Veronica continued, her professional smile growing more strained by the second. "Do you speak English, French, Mandarin?" Raina's expression didn't change. She simply stood there, her leather briefcase at her side, watching Veronica with the patience of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. "This is ridiculous," muttered James Crawford, the assistant manager, as he hurried over with a tablet in his hands. His usually immaculate tie hung slightly askew, and perspiration beaded on his forehead, despite the lobby's perfectly controlled climate. "I've called for a translator, but they won't be here for another hour." Elliot resumed his mopping, but his movements had slowed. Something about the scene unfolding before him felt familiar, the frustration of adults trying to communicate across an invisible barrier, the assumption that louder somehow meant clearer, the complete failure to recognize that silence might be a choice rather than an obstacle. "Ma'am," Veronica's voice had taken on the artificial sweetness that customer service professionals deployed when their patience had long since evaporated. "I'm going to need you to cooperate here. We have other guests waiting." Indeed, a small crowd had begun to gather. Business travelers checked their watches with increasing irritation, while hotel staff whispered among themselves, their confusion palpable. The concierge, a distinguished man named Robert, who had worked at the Royal Grand for nearly 2 decades, approached with hesitant steps. "Perhaps I might be of assistance." Robert offered, his British accent lending gravitas to the situation. I speak a bit of Japanese from my time in Kyoto. Veronica's relief was visible. Thank you, Robert. Please explain to this woman that she needs to provide identification and credit card information to complete her reservation. Robert cleared his throat and began speaking in halting Japanese, his pronunciation careful but clearly unpracticed. Sumimasen anata no. He paused, searching for words, then continued with obvious uncertainty. Raina listened politely, but her expression remained unchanged. When Robert finished his awkward explanation, she simply looked at him with the same patient silence she had shown Veronica. Well, Veronica demanded. Robert's face flushed slightly. I'm afraid my Japanese may not be quite adequate for this situation. The frustration in the lobby was becoming thick enough to cut. Other guests had begun forming a loose semicircle around the reception desk, some openly staring, while others pretended to check their phones while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. The morning light streaming through the hotel's floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated the scene with crystalline clarity, creating a stage where cultural barriers and human misunderstanding played out in real time. Elliot found himself moving closer, though he couldn't have explained why. His mop bucket trailed behind him with soft squeaks that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. He had learned through 3 years of grief and silence to recognize the difference between someone who couldn't speak and someone who chose not to. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable, like the difference between an empty room and one where someone was hiding. Look, Veronica said, her professional mask finally slipping to reveal the sharp edges of genuine annoyance. I don't know what kind of game this is, but this is a business establishment, not a charity for people who refuse to communicate properly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering too long. Several staff members shifted uncomfortably, while the gathered guests began murmuring among themselves. Someone near the back of the crowd pulled out their phone, and Elliot could see the telltale glow of a video recording beginning. Raina's composure remained unshakable, but something flickered in her eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of profound disappointment that seemed to encompass more than just this moment, this misunderstanding. It was the look of someone who had seen this particular failure of human connection play out too many times before. Ma'am, James interjected, stepping forward with his tablet. Perhaps you could write down your information or use a translation app. He thrust the device toward her with the aggressive helpfulness of someone desperate to solve a problem he didn't understand. Raina glanced at the screen, then back at his face, and Elliot caught something in her expression, a flicker of what might have been amusement or perhaps pity. This is getting us nowhere, Veronica declared, her voice rising just enough to carry to the watching crowd. I'm going to have to ask security to escort you out, unless you can provide proper identification and communicate like a normal person. The words hit the lobby like a physical blow. The murmuring stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt completely different from the peaceful quiet Elliot had been enjoying just minutes before. This was the silence of held breath, of social boundaries being crossed, of dignity under assault. Elliot's hands tightened on his mop handle. He thought of Charlotte sitting in speech therapy sessions, where well-meaning adults pushed and prodded and demanded words that simply wouldn't come. He thought of the nights he'd held her while she cried silently, her small body shaking with frustrations too complex for tears to express. He thought of his late wife, Sarah, who had taught him that listening was often more important than speaking, that sometimes the most profound communications happened in the spaces between words. The phone cameras were multiplying now. At least 3 people were recording their faces, lit by the glow of their screens, as they captured what would surely become another viral moment of human failure. Elliot could already imagine the comments, the shares, the way this woman's dignity would be dissected and commodified by strangers who would never know her story. "Security is on their way," James announced, speaking into his radio with obvious reluctance. "We need assistance at the front desk." Raina stood perfectly still in the center of the growing storm, her silence no longer mysterious, but somehow noble. She had become a fixed point around which chaos swirled, her refusal to engage serving as a mirror that reflected everyone else's assumptions and failures back at them. Elliot made a decision that surprised him even as he was making it. He set down his mop, straightened his shoulders, and stepped into the circle of watching faces. The crowd parted slightly as he approached their attention, shifting to this new player in the unfolding drama. He was acutely aware of how he must look, faded polo shirt, with the hotel's logo work pants that had seen better days, the subtle scent of cleaning chemicals that clung to his clothes like an invisible badge of his station. But he had learned something important in the years since Sarah's death. Dignity wasn't about what you wore or where you stood in the hierarchy. It was about how you chose to treat other human beings when you thought no one important was watching. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension without raising in volume. Veronica turned toward him with barely concealed irritation. "Elliot, please return to your duties. This doesn't concern you." But Elliot was no longer looking at Veronica. His attention was focused entirely on Raina Saito, this woman whose silence had revealed so much about everyone around her. Up close, he could see the subtle signs of jet lag around her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw that spoke of someone accustomed to being in control, who had found herself in an impossible situation. And then, to the surprise of everyone in the lobby, most of all himself, Elliot began to speak. "Ohayo gozaimasu," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Watashi no namae wa Elliot desu. Anata wa Nihongo o hanashimasu ka." The effect was immediate and electric. Raina's carefully controlled expression shifted surprise, flickering across her features, before being replaced by something that might have been relief. The crowd fell silent, their attention now riveted on this unexpected development. "Hi," Raina replied, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated in Tokyo's finest schools. "Nihongo o hanashimasu." The simple exchange. "Good morning, my name is Elliot. Do you speak Japanese?" "Yes, I speak Japanese," seemed to diffuse the tension like air being released from a balloon. But Elliot was just getting started. "Gomen nasai." He continued, bowing slightly, in a gesture that spoke of genuine respect rather than tourist guide approximation. "Koko no hitotachi wa anata ni taisuru taido ga warukute hontou ni moshiwake arimasen." "I'm sorry. The people here have been rude to you, and I sincerely apologize." Raina's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since entering the hotel, her perfect composure cracked just enough to reveal genuine emotion underneath. She studied Elliot's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time, taking in not just his words, but the respect with which he delivered them. "Arigato gozaimasu," she said quietly. "Anata no shinsetsu ni kansha shite imasu." "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness." The crowd around them had grown completely still, the kind of absolute silence that occurs when people realize they're witnessing something significant, but don't yet understand what it means. Phone cameras continued recording, but now they were capturing something entirely different from what they had expected. Elliot could feel Veronica's furious stare burning into the side of his head, could sense the confusion and growing embarrassment of the staff members who had just moments before been preparing to call security on a woman whose only crime had been speaking a different language. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the spark of connection he had seen in Raina's eyes, the recognition of one human being truly seeing another. "Ocha wa ikaga desu ka?" he asked, gesturing toward the hotel's elegant seating area. Sukoshi yasunde kudasai. Would you like some tea? Please rest for a moment. It was such a simple offer, the kind of basic hospitality that should have been extended the moment she walked through the doors. But in the context of everything that had just transpired, it carried the weight of an apology for an entire culture of misunderstanding. Raina nodded slowly, and Elliot could see her making a decision that went far beyond accepting or declining refreshments. She was choosing to trust, to step outside the protective silence that had served as both shield and test. Arigatai desu, she said. Ocha o onegai ishimasu. That would be grateful. Please tea. As Elliot guided her toward a quiet corner of the lobby, the crowd began to disperse with the disappointed energy of people whose entertainment had suddenly transformed into something too intimate to keep watching. But the phones kept recording, and the story was already beginning to write itself in real time across social media platforms where context would be flattened and complexity reduced to hashtags. Veronica remained frozen behind the reception desk, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, anger, and dawning realization that whatever had just happened would have consequences far beyond a simple customer service interaction. James stood beside her, his tablet forgotten in his hands, staring after Elliot with an expression that suggested he was mentally recalculating everything he thought he knew about the quiet janitor who mopped floors and fixed broken things without complaint. In the seating area surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, Elliot found himself in the surreal position of having tea with a woman who was clearly accustomed to boardrooms and international negotiations. The incongruity of the situation wasn't lost on him, a hotel janitor and a corporate executive communicating in a language that belonged to neither of their birth countries, brought together by the simple human need to be understood. Anata no Nihongo wa totemo jouzu desu ne, Raina said, as they settled into chairs across from each other. Doko de naratano desu ka? Your Japanese is very good. Where did you learn it? The question hung between them, simple on the surface, but carrying undertones that Elliot recognized. She wasn't just asking about language learning. She was asking about story, about the path that had led a hotel janitor to speak fluent Japanese with what she clearly recognized as a Kyoto accent. Tsuma kara narimashita. Elliot replied, the words carrying a weight that had nothing to do with grammar or vocabulary. Kanojo wa Nihon jin deshita. I learned from my wife. She was Japanese. The past tense settled between them, like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that went far beyond language. Raina's expression softened, and Elliot could see her absorbing not just his words, but the careful way he had chosen them, the respect inherent in his use of formal speech patterns when referring to his late wife. Gomen nasai, she said quietly. Tsuma-san wa? I'm sorry. Your wife. Sanen mae ni nakunarimashita. Elliot completed the thought she couldn't finish. Gandeshita. She died 3 years ago. Cancer. The simple statement carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories, sleepless nights in hospital corridors, conversations about the future that would never come to pass, the slow process of learning to live with an absence that felt larger than any presence ever had. Raina absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved, her silence now carrying the weight of recognition rather than mystery. A hotel staff member approached with a tea service, moving with the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure what protocols applied to this unprecedented situation. The young woman, her name tag read Miranda, set down the elegant porcelain service with practiced grace, but Elliot could see her stealing glances at him as if he had suddenly transformed into an entirely different person. Arigato gozaimasu. Raina said to Miranda, who smiled nervously and hurried away to report this latest development to the increasingly agitated management team. As Elliot poured tea with movements Sarah had taught him years ago, the specific angle of the pot, the precise distance from cup to spout, the slight pause that allowed the last drop to fall cleanly, he could feel the weight of attention from across the lobby. Staff members were trying to look busy while obviously straining to overhear their conversation. The few remaining guests were pretending to read newspapers while stealing glances at the unlikely pair. Kyoto no akusento desu ne, Raina observed, accepting her cup with both hands, in a gesture of respect that told Elliot she had been raised with traditional values despite her obvious Western business success. Tsuma-san wa Kyoto no hito deshita ka. You have a Kyoto accent. Was your wife from Kyoto? Hi. Elliot nodded, remembering Sarah's pride in her ancient city's dialect, the way she had insisted on teaching him not just Japanese, but the specific cultural nuances that came with her hometown's particular way of speaking. Kanojo wa itsumo itte imashita, Kyoto no kotoba wa kokoro o arawarashimasu. Yes, she always said Kyoto's language reveals the heart. The quote hung between them like a bridge across not just language barriers, but the deeper chasms of human experience. Raina set down her cup with the careful precision of someone thinking carefully about her next words. Anata no kokoro wa totemo yasashi desu, she said finally. Kyo watashi wa totemo sabishikata. Daremo watashi no kimochi o wakate kuranakata. Demo anata wa. Your heart is very gentle. Today I was very lonely. No one understood my feelings. But you. She paused, searching for words that could adequately express the gratitude she felt for being truly seen by a stranger when the people paid to serve her had failed so completely. Anata wa watashi o hito tu shaite maite kuremashita, she finished quietly. Tada no kyaku toshite dewa naku. You saw me as a person, not just as a customer. Elliot felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For 3 years, he had moved through the world focused primarily on Charlotte's needs and his own grief, maintaining the careful, emotional distance that allowed him to function without falling apart. But sitting here speaking Sarah's language with this elegant stranger who had been reduced to silence by others' assumptions, he felt something awakening that he had thought was permanently dormant. Musume ga imasu, he found himself saying, though he hadn't planned to share such personal information. Kanojo mo hanasanai koto ga arimasu. Iroiro nariu de. I have a daughter. She also sometimes doesn't speak. For various reasons. Raina leaned forward slightly, her attention focusing with laser intensity on his words. In the business world, she was known for her ability to identify the crucial information hidden within casual conversation, but this felt different. This was personal interest, human connection, rather than strategic advantage. Nansai desu ka? She asked gently. How old is she? Nanasai desu. Charlotte, tu iaimasu. Elliot's voice carried the particular warmth reserved for fathers discussing their children. Mama ga nakunatte kara amari hanasanaku narimashita. Kotoba ga dete konai mitai desu. 7 years old. Her name is Charlotte. Since her mother died, she doesn't speak much. It's like the words won't come out. Understanding flickered in Raina's eyes, and Elliot realized that his decision to speak Japanese with her had revealed more than just linguistic ability. It had shown her something about who he was as a person. Someone who understood what it meant to communicate across barriers, who had learned patience through love and loss, who recognized that silence wasn't always empty, but sometimes full of things too complex for words. Watashi mo kodomo no toki yoku damarishite imashita. Raina said softly, her formal business facade continuing to crack, revealing glimpses of something more vulnerable underneath. Chichi ga totemo kibishikute machigai o suru no ga kowakata. Dakara nanini mo iwanai hou ga anzen deshita. I was often silent as a child, too. My father was very strict, and I was afraid of making mistakes, so it was safer to say nothing. The admission hung between them a small offering of vulnerability that transformed their conversation from polite exchange to genuine connection. Elliot could see the weight of years in her words, the careful construction of a personality designed to navigate a world where any sign of uncertainty could be weaponized against her. Across the lobby, Veronica was conducting an increasingly agitated conversation with what appeared to be her supervisor, gesturing emphatically toward Elliot and Raina while speaking in urgent whispers. Other staff members were clustering around the reception desk, like metal filings drawn to a magnet, their normal duties forgotten, in favor of trying to understand how their quiet janitor had just diffused a situation that had seemed headed for security intervention. Kono hoteru de hataraite iru no wa naze desu ka? Raina asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Anata no yona hito nara moto, ii shigoto ga dekiru to omoimasu ga. Why do you work at this hotel? I think someone like you could do better work. It was a question that cut straight to the heart of assumptions about class and worth delivered without the condescension that usually accompanied such inquiries. Elliot could hear the genuine puzzlement in her voice, not judgment, but a recognition that his capabilities seemed incongruent with his current position. Charlotte no tame desu, he answered simply. Kono shigoto nara kanojo ga gakko kara kaete kuru toki ni ie ni iru koto ga dekimasu. Soshite kenku hoken mo arimasu. For Charlotte. This job allows me to be home when she gets back from school. And there's health insurance. The practical reality of single parenthood distilled into its essential elements. Raina nodded slowly, and Elliot could see her processing not just his words, but the entire structure of a life built around someone else's needs, where personal ambition took a back seat to parental responsibility. Ripa nao tusan desu ne, she said with quiet respect. Charlotte-chan wa shiawase na kodesu. You're an admirable father. Charlotte is a lucky child. Before Elliot could respond, the lobby's atmosphere shifted again as two security guards appeared at the entrance, summoned by James's earlier radio call. They approached the reception desk with the cautious bearing of men unsure what situation they were walking into, their confusion obvious as they took in the scene before them, the elegant Japanese woman sipping tea peacefully with the hotel's janitor, their conversation flowing in a language none of the surrounding staff could understand. Veronica intercepted the security guards with visible frustration, her gestures becoming more animated as she explained a situation that clearly made less sense with each passing moment. Elliot could see her pointing in their direction, could read the mounting embarrassment in her body language as she tried to justify calling security on a guest who was now clearly engaged in pleasant conversation. Mondai ga okote iru mitai desu ne. Raina observed her voice carrying a note of dry amusement as she watched the increasingly frantic conference taking place across the lobby. It seems there's a problem developing. Elliot followed her gaze and sighed quietly. He had known this moment would come, the inevitable reckoning, where his simple act of human decency would be processed through the hotel's bureaucratic machinery and emerge transformed into some kind of violation or overreach. Watashi watada anata ga komate iru no omite hanaso, to omtsu tadake desu, he said. Shigoto no koto wa kangaete imasen deshita. I just saw that you were in trouble and thought I should speak up. I wasn't thinking about work. Sono tame ni shikarareru no desu ka? Raina's question carried an edge that hadn't been there before, a hint of the steel that had made her successful in a business world that rarely welcomed women, especially Asian women, in positions of real power. Will you be scolded for that? Before Elliot could answer, Veronica was striding toward them, with the determined gait of someone who had decided that the situation had gone on long enough. The security guards flanked her at a respectful distance, their presence serving more as moral support than actual threat, but the message was clear. Elliot! Veronica's voice carried the artificial sweetness that meant real trouble was brewing. I need you to return to your duties immediately. I'm sure our guest appreciates your assistance, but this is highly irregular. She addressed her comments solely to Elliot, as if Raina were either incapable of understanding English or simply irrelevant to the conversation. It was a calculated slight that revealed more about Veronica's character than any amount of corporate sensitivity training could have disguised. Raina set down her teacup with deliberate precision and rose from her chair, every movement radiating the kind of authority that commanded boardrooms and silenced opposition. When she spoke, her English was flawless, carrying the slight British accent that marked the most exclusive international educations. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, she said, her voice pitched to carry across the lobby without seeming raised. Mr. Barnes has provided the first genuine hospitality I have encountered since entering your establishment. The words hit Veronica like a physical blow. The carefully constructed narrative, difficult foreign guest, heroic staff intervention, necessary security measures, crumbled in the face of articulate, educated English delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. You speak English? Veronica stammered, her professional composure finally deserting her entirely. Among other languages, Raina replied coolly. I was simply curious to see how your staff would handle a guest who required accommodation rather than assumption. The results have been illuminating. The lobby had gone completely silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Where before it had been the eager attention of people watching drama unfold, now it carried the heavy weight of witnessed judgment. Staff members exchanged glances that spoke of careers potentially derailed and reputations permanently damaged. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding, Veronica began, but Raina cut her off with a gesture that managed to be both polite and utterly dismissive. The only person who showed me any genuine respect or courtesy was Mr. Barnes. She continued her attention, focusing on Elliot with an intensity that made him acutely aware of every camera phone still recording in the lobby's shadows. While your staff prepared to have me removed from the premises, he alone recognized that dignity is not dependent on language or position. The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Elliot could see the precise moment when Veronica realized that whatever complaint or disciplinary action she had been planning would now be impossible. The woman she had nearly had ejected by security was clearly someone of significant importance, and the janitor she had been prepared to reprimand had just been publicly credited with saving the hotel from a customer service disaster of epic proportions. I trust Mr. Barnes will face no repercussions for his kindness, Raina added the statement, carrying the subtle weight of a threat wrapped in silk. I would hate for my experience here to include witnessing the punishment of the only person who truly understood the meaning of hospitality. Veronica's smile was now so brittle it seemed likely to shatter at any moment. Of course not, ma'am. We greatly appreciate initiative from all our staff members. The lie was transparent, but it was also binding. With cameras recording and a guest of obvious importance watching, Veronica had no choice but to publicly endorse Elliot's actions regardless of whatever private consequences she might be planning. Raina turned back to Elliot, switching effortlessly back to Japanese. Kyo wa hontoni arigatu gozaimashita. Anata no yasashisa o wasurenai to omoimasu. Thank you so much for today. I don't think I'll forget your kindness. Doitashimashite, Elliot replied quietly. Mata ai mashiru koto ga atte mo ureshi desu. You're welcome. I would be happy if we could meet again. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. In 3 years of careful emotional distance, he had learned to limit his connections to the safe boundaries of professional courtesy and parental responsibility. But something about this encounter had awakened possibilities he thought he had buried with Sarah. Raina smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her since she'd entered the hotel. Watashi mo so omoimasu. Saito Raina desu. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. I think so too. I am Raina Saito. Please treat me favorably. The formal introduction coming after their extended conversation carried ritual significance that transcended mere politeness. It was an acknowledgement that what had begun as a chance encounter had transformed into something that merited a proper beginning. Barnes Elliot desu, he replied, bowing slightly. Kochira koso yoroshiku onegai shimasu. I am Elliot Barnes. I'm the one who should be asking for favorable treatment. As they completed their introductions, Elliot became aware that their conversation had drawn an even larger audience than before. Hotel guests were no longer pretending to read newspapers or check phones. They were openly watching this unprecedented interaction between a janitor and what was clearly a very important guest. The security guards remained in position, but looked increasingly unnecessary, while Veronica hovered nearby with the expression of someone trying to calculate how much damage control would be required. I should complete my check-in, Raina said, switching back to English and including Veronica in her attention with the graciousness of someone who could afford to be magnanimous in victory. I trust that won't be a problem now. Of course not, Miss. Veronica's voice trailed off hopefully. Saito. I have a reservation under Meridian International Holdings. The name hit the reception desk like a lightning bolt. Elliot could see recognition flickering across multiple faces as staff members processed the implications. Meridian International Holdings was one of the hotel's largest corporate clients, responsible for millions of dollars in annual revenue. The woman they had nearly escorted out was not just any guest, she was quite possibly one of the most important customers they would see all year. Ms. Saito. Veronica's transformation was instantaneous and absolutely shameless. What an honor to have you staying with us. I do apologize for the earlier confusion. If there's anything we can do to make your stay more comfortable. Raina accepted the sudden attention with the weary grace of someone who had witnessed this particular transformation countless times before. Power, Elliot realized, wasn't just about money or position. It was about watching people reorganize their entire personalities based on their perception of your worth. Mr. Barnes has already ensured that my stay is off to an excellent start. Raina replied smoothly. I couldn't ask for better service. The compliment delivered in front of the gathered crowd and recording phones would ensure that whatever consequences Veronica had been planning for Elliot's intervention would have to be permanently shelved. More than that, it had transformed him from rule-breaking janitor to customer service hero in the space of a single sentence. As Raina moved toward the reception desk to complete her check-in, she paused beside Elliot one final time. Charlotte-chan ni yoroshiku, she said quietly, her words meant for him alone. Anata no yuna otusan ga ite kanojo wa kanarazu daijubu ni narimasu. Give my regards to Charlotte. With a father like you, She will definitely be all right." The words hit Elliot with unexpected force. For 3 years, he had questioned every decision, second-guessed. Every choice, wondered if he was enough for a little girl who had lost so much so young. To hear confidence in his parenting from this accomplished stranger, delivered in the language his late wife had taught him, felt like a benediction he hadn't known he needed. "Arigatou gozaimasu." He managed his voice rougher than he intended. Raina smiled one final time, then moved away to complete her business with a reception staff that was now falling over itself to provide perfect service. Elliot watched her go, this elegant woman who had entered as a problem to be solved and was leaving as the solution to problems he hadn't even known existed. The lobby gradually returned to its normal rhythm as the crowd dispersed and staff members reluctantly returned to their duties. But Elliot could feel the weight of changed circumstances settling around him like an altered atmosphere. The phones that had recorded the entire interaction were already uploading videos that would soon find their way across social media platforms, carrying his story far beyond the marble walls of the Royal Grand Hotel. As he returned to his mop bucket, Elliot found himself thinking about Charlotte, who would be getting out of school in a few hours and would want to hear about his day. For the first time in months, he would have something genuinely interesting to tell her, a story about kindness bridging differences, about the importance of really seeing other people, about how sometimes the most meaningful connections happened in the most unexpected places. He didn't yet know that by evening, hashtags would be trending with his name. He couldn't have imagined that morning news shows would be calling the hotel looking for interviews, or that his simple act of human decency would be dissected and analyzed by social media experts and cultural commentators. He had no way of knowing that Raina Saito was not just any successful businesswoman, but the CEO of one of Japan's largest international conglomerates, or that their conversation had been witnessed by exactly the right combination of people to transform a moment of connection into a viral phenomenon. All he knew was that for the first time since Sarah's death, the silence in his life felt full of possibility rather than emptiness. And as he resumed mopping the marble floors of the Royal Grand Hotel, Elliot Barnes allowed himself to wonder what might happen when those possibilities began to unfold. The morning sun continued streaming through the lobby's windows, casting the same fractured rainbows across the floor. But everything else had fundamentally changed. In the space of a single conversation, conducted in a language that belonged to neither speaker's birth country, 2 lives had been altered in ways that would only become clear in the days and weeks to come. And somewhere in the digital realm, the first video had already been shared, carrying with it a simple caption that would soon be seen by millions. "Janitor speaks perfect Japanese to silent CEO and changes everything." The story was just beginning. The video went viral within 6 hours. Elliot discovered this not through social media. He barely used his phone for anything beyond calling Charlotte's school and ordering groceries, but through the increasingly frantic behavior of his coworkers. By noon, the hotel's usually efficient staff had devolved into clusters of whispering employees who fell silent whenever he approached with his cleaning cart. "Did you see the comments?" Miranda, the young woman who had served tea that morning, cornered him near the service elevator. Her eyes were bright with excitement and something that might have been envy. "People are calling you a hero. There's already a hashtag Janitor Hero." Elliot paused in his methodical wiping of brass fixtures, a task that usually provided the kind of mindless meditation he craved. Comments. On the videos. "There must be 5 different angles of what happened this morning. The one with the best audio has over 2 million views already." Miranda thrust her phone toward him, the screen showing a familiar scene from an angle that made the lobby look like a movie set. The video showed him approaching Raina, but from this perspective, their size difference was more pronounced, the contrast between his worn work clothes and her elegant suit more stark. The audio was surprisingly clear, capturing not just their Japanese conversation, but the undertone of genuine respect that had characterized their interaction. "I don't understand most of what you're saying," Miranda continued, scrolling through comments that flowed like a digital waterfall. "But people are translating it in real time. Look at this one." He apologized for how rude everyone was being, in perfect Japanese, while she was being treated like garbage. And this one, that bow when he offered tea. That's real respect, not customer service theater. Elliot handed back her phone without reading further. The idea that his private moment of connection with Raina had become entertainment for millions of strangers felt deeply unsettling, like having someone read his diary aloud to a stadium full of people. "It's just a misunderstanding getting bigger," he said quietly, returning to his cleaning, with perhaps more focus than brass fixtures typically required. But Miranda was far from finished. "There's already articles being written." Business Insider called it a masterclass in cross-cultural communication. The Wall Street Journal is apparently working on a piece about corporate hospitality training, and someone identified Miss Saito. "Did you know she's worth like $2 billion? The number hung in the air between them like a foreign concept. Elliot had known Raina was successful, had sensed the kind of quiet authority that came from wielding real power, but the actual scope of her influence was staggering. He thought about their conversation over tea, how naturally she had shared details about her childhood silence, how genuinely she had listened when he talked about Charlotte. Wealth on that scale usually created barriers that made authentic human connection nearly impossible, yet somehow they had found their way past those obstacles to something real. "Mr. Barnes." The voice belonged to James Crawford, the assistant manager, and it carried a tone Elliot had never heard directed toward him before, something between respect and nervous energy. "Ms. Hale would like to see you in her office." The walk to Veronica's office felt longer than usual past guest rooms, where he had replaced countless burned-out bulbs and fixed dozens of dripping faucets, past conference rooms, where he had set up chairs for meetings discussing budgets that exceeded his annual salary. Other staff members watched his progress with expressions ranging from admiration to anxiety, as if his sudden visibility had somehow elevated their own stakes in whatever was about to unfold. Veronica's office was a shrine to hospitality industry achievement, with framed awards and photographs documenting her rise through the corporate hierarchy. She sat behind her mahogany desk with the rigid posture of someone who had spent the morning fielding phone calls from superiors who wanted explanations for social media coverage they didn't understand. "Elliot, please sit." Her voice had lost the sharp edge from the morning's confrontation, replaced by the careful neutrality of someone navigating uncharted territory. "We need to discuss what happened today." Elliot settled into the chair across from her desk, the same seat where he had once received his employee handbook and signed forms acknowledging his understanding of the hotel's policies regarding guest interaction. The irony wasn't lost on him that those same policies were now the subject of emergency revisions happening in corporate offices across the country. "I want you to know that the hotel appreciates your initiative this morning." Veronica continued, consulting notes that suggested this conversation had been carefully planned. "Your ability to communicate with Ms. Saito clearly prevented what could have been a very unfortunate situation." The words came out stilted, as if she were reading from a script written by the legal department. Elliot could see the struggle in her expression, the tension between her instinct to maintain rigid hierarchies and the reality that those hierarchies had just been publicly exposed as inadequate. "However," she continued, and Elliot heard the familiar warning in that single word, We need to establish clear protocols for how such situations should be handled in the future. Guest relations is a specialized area that requires specific training and authorization. I understand, Elliot said quietly. He had expected this conversation, had known that his moment of human decency would need to be processed through corporate machinery and emerge as policy recommendations and procedure updates. That said, Veronica's tone shifted again, becoming warmer but also more calculated. The positive response to this morning's events has created some interesting opportunities. We've received several interview requests from media outlets wanting to discuss our innovative approach to customer service. The corporate office is very interested in showcasing our staff's cultural competency and dedication to guest satisfaction. Elliot felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. The idea of being paraded in front of cameras, of having his personal story dissected for corporate marketing purposes, made him deeply uncomfortable. He thought about Charlotte, who would be getting out of school in a few hours, who needed her father to be a steady, predictable presence rather than a social media phenomenon. I appreciate the opportunity, he said carefully. But I'd prefer to just continue doing my job. Veronica's smile grew more strained. I understand your reluctance, Elliot, but you have to realize that this story has taken on a life of its own. The hotel has a responsibility to respond appropriately to the attention we're receiving. And frankly, your cooperation would go a long way toward ensuring that this remains a positive story for everyone involved. The implicit threat was delivered with the kind of professional politeness that made it impossible to challenge directly. Elliot could read between the lines, cooperate with the publicity machine, or find himself dealing with the less pleasant consequences of sudden visibility. What exactly would that cooperation involve? He asked. Nothing too demanding, Veronica replied, consulting her notes again. A few brief interviews, perhaps a photo session, showcasing our diverse and talented staff. The corporate communications team has some very tasteful ideas for highlighting the cultural exchange aspects of what happened. Before Elliot could respond, Veronica's phone rang with the urgent tone that indicated a call from someone too important to ignore. She glanced at the caller ID, and her expression shifted to something between excitement and panic. Excuse me, I need to take this, she answered with the overly bright tone reserved for corporate superiors. Yes, Mr. Harrison, thank you for calling back. Yes, we're managing the situation very carefully. Elliot could hear the distant murmur of an agitated voice on the other end of the line, the kind of rapid-fire questioning that suggested someone several levels above Veronica's pay grade was personally involved in managing what had become a corporate crisis. No, sir, absolutely not, Veronica continued, her voice rising slightly. Mr. Barnes has been completely cooperative. In fact, we're discussing expanded opportunities for him to represent the hotel's commitment to excellence. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Veronica providing increasingly creative descriptions of how the morning's events had been part of a broader cultural sensitivity initiative. Elliot listened with growing amazement at how quickly his simple act of kindness was being transformed into evidence of corporate strategy and forward-thinking management. When she finally hung up, Veronica's expression had shifted to something approaching desperation. That was regional headquarters. They're sending a team down this afternoon to assess our response to the media attention. Elliot, I'm going to be very frank with you. My career is riding on how well we handle this situation. I need you to help me demonstrate that what happened this morning was the result of excellent training and preparation, not a lucky accident. The confession hung between them with surprising honesty. For the first time since he'd known her, Veronica was speaking to him as one human being to another, acknowledging that the corporate hierarchy that usually separated them had been temporarily suspended by circumstances neither of them had anticipated. I understand you want to protect your privacy, she continued. But the story is already out there. The question is whether we control the narrative or let other people define what happened. And frankly, some of the speculation online is getting quite creative. She turned her computer screen toward him, revealing a stream of social media posts that made his morning interaction with Raina look like the opening scene of various romantic comedies, international thrillers, and social justice documentaries. The comments ranged from touching tributes to working-class dignity to elaborate conspiracy theories about corporate espionage and romantic manipulation. People are already creating their own version of who you are and what this story means, Veronica explained. Wouldn't you rather have some input into that narrative? Elliot stared at the screen, watching strangers dissect his life with the casual confidence of people who had never been subjected to such scrutiny themselves. Someone had already found his late wife's obituary and was speculating about whether his interaction with Raina represented some kind of emotional rebound. Another commenter had located Charlotte's speech therapy records through means that seemed both illegal and impossibly invasive. They found information about Charlotte, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of warning that made Veronica look up sharply. I'm sure that's just speculation, she began, but Elliot was already pointing to a comment that included details about Charlotte's school and therapy sessions that could only have come from someone with access to confidential medical records. This needs to stop, Elliot said, standing abruptly. The protective instinct that had carried him through 3 years of single parenthood was now fully engaged, transforming him from accommodating employee to fierce guardian in the space of a heartbeat. Elliot, please sit down. We can manage this situation if we work together. Veronica's voice carried the kind of forced calm that suggested she was beginning to realize how quickly positive publicity could transform into legal liability. I need to pick up my daughter from school, Elliot said firmly. Whatever corporate strategy you're developing, it doesn't include putting a 7-year-old girl in the public spotlight. He was already moving toward the door when Veronica's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID made her face go completely white. Ms. Saito is calling, she announced, as if the name carried supernatural power. She's asking to speak with you directly. Elliot paused with his hand on the door handle. The idea of talking to Raina again sent conflicting emotions through his chest. Anticipation at reconnecting with someone who had understood him so clearly. Anxiety about what her call might mean for his carefully constructed private life. Should I tell her you're unavailable? Veronica asked, though her tone suggested this would be professional suicide. I'll take it, Elliot said quietly, returning to his chair. Veronica handed him the phone with the careful reverence usually reserved for handling explosives. Ms. Saito, I have Elliot Barnes here for you. Elliot. Raina's voice carried clearly through the speaker, and hearing her say his name with the slight accent that flavored her English made something warm unfold in his chest. I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all, he replied, acutely aware that Veronica was listening to every word while pretending to organize papers that didn't need organizing. I wanted to apologize, Raina continued, and the genuine regret in her voice surprised him. I had no idea that our conversation this morning would attract so much attention. I've been watching the news coverage and I'm concerned about how this might affect you and your daughter. The fact that she had remembered Charlotte's name, that she was thinking about how the publicity might impact a 7-year-old girl she had never met, told Elliot everything he needed to know about her character. It's not your fault, he said. People recorded what happened. That was their choice. Perhaps, but I have experience managing media attention, and you clearly don't. If you're willing, I'd like to offer some assistance in handling this situation. Veronica's eyes widened at the implication that one of the hotel's most important clients was offering to personally involve herself in the career development of their maintenance staff. The corporate protocols for such a scenario simply didn't exist. "What kind of assistance?" Elliot asked carefully. "I have a very good public relations team that specializes in protecting privacy while managing necessary publicity. They've helped me maintain boundaries between my professional and personal life for many years. More importantly, they understand how to keep families, especially children, completely out of the public eye." The offer was as unexpected as it was generous. Elliot tried to imagine what kind of PR team someone worth $2 billion might employ, what resources they would bring to bear on protecting a janitor's daughter from internet curiosity. "Why would you do that?" he asked. There was a pause that carried weight, as if Raina were considering how much honesty the moment required. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Because this morning you saw me as a person rather than a problem to be solved. In my experience, that kind of genuine human connection is rare enough to be worth protecting." Another pause. "And because I understand what it's like to have your privacy become a public commodity." Elliot could hear the years of experience in her words, the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of public attention while protecting the parts of herself that mattered most. "I need to discuss this with Charlotte," he said finally. "She's been through enough changes lately, without adding media attention to the mix." "Of course," Raina replied immediately. "Family comes first, always." The conviction in her voice suggested this wasn't just polite agreement, but a principle that had guided her own difficult choices. "However," she continued, "I should mention that the story is spreading very quickly across international media. My assistant tells me that outlets in Japan, Korea, and several European countries are already picking it up. The longer we wait to establish some kind of narrative control, the more difficult it becomes to protect your privacy." The information hit Elliot like cold water. He had been thinking in terms of local news coverage, perhaps a brief mention in regional papers. The idea that his conversation with Raina was becoming international news felt surreal and deeply frightening. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Hours, not days," Raina replied honestly. "International business media moves very quickly when there's a human interest angle to a corporate story. And unfortunately, my involvement makes this much more newsworthy than it would be otherwise." Elliot looked at Veronica, who was now openly eavesdropping, while making notes that would undoubtedly become part of a crisis management strategy. The hotel's interests were clearly aligned with maximum publicity, regardless of what that might mean for his family's privacy. "Can I call you back in an hour?" he asked. "I need to talk to Charlotte before I make any decisions." "Of course. I'll have my assistant send my direct number to the hotel. And Elliot..." Raina's voice softened slightly. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I meant what I said this morning about Charlotte being lucky to have you as a father. Don't let the noise change how you see yourself or your priorities." The line went dead, leaving Elliot alone with Veronica and the weight of decisions that would affect not just his own life, but his daughter's future. He handed back the phone and stood to leave, but Veronica's voice stopped him at the door. "Elliot, I hope you understand that the hotel's position in all of this is somewhat delicate. We need to present a unified front to the media." He turned back to face her, seeing clearly for the first time the full scope of the pressure she was under. Corporate headquarters was demanding a success story, media outlets were creating narratives with or without cooperation, and a billionaire CEO was offering to personally intervene in an employee's career management. Any misstep could result in lawsuits, lost contracts, and ruined careers. "I understand," he said quietly. "But Charlotte comes first. Everything else is negotiable." The drive to Charlotte's school took him through neighborhoods where normal life continued. Unchanged, people walking dogs, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers skateboarding with the casual confidence of youth. The contrast with his morning's surreal transformation felt jarring, as if he were moving between parallel universes that operated according to completely different rules. Pinewood Elementary School occupied a sprawling campus, designed with the optimistic architecture of the 1980s, all bright colors and open spaces that suggested education should be joyful rather than institutional. Elliot had spent countless hours in these hallways over the past 3 years, attending parent-teacher conferences, speech therapy consultations, and the various meetings that comprised the support network Charlotte needed to navigate her silent world. Henderson, Charlotte's teacher, met him at the main office with an expression that suggested the day's events had somehow reached even this protected environment. "Mr. Barnes," she said carefully, "I hope you don't mind, but we've had some unusual phone calls today. Reporters asking about Charlotte, wanting to verify information they claim to have found online." The protective rage that flared in Elliot's chest was immediate and fierce. The idea that strangers were calling his daughter's school, potentially disrupting her carefully maintained routine, made him want to find whoever had posted her information and explain the concept of boundaries in very direct terms. "What did you tell them?" he asked, working to keep his voice level. "Nothing, of course. We have strict policies about student privacy. But Mr. Barnes, some of these calls were quite persistent. One reporter claimed to have information about Charlotte's speech therapy and wanted to confirm details for what he called a human interest follow-up. The violation felt personal and profound. Charlotte's journey with selective mutism was private, a struggle she was fighting with tremendous courage and the support of people who truly understood her needs. The idea that her therapeutic progress might become fodder for strangers' entertainment made Elliot's hands clench into fists. "Where is she now?" he asked. "In the library with Ms. Patricia. We thought it best to keep her away from the main office until you arrived." The library was Charlotte's favorite refuge at school, a quiet space where her silence felt less conspicuous and her love of books could flourish without social pressure. Elliot found her in the corner reading Nook, curled up with a picture book about a little girl who communicated with animals. She looked up when he approached, and her face brightened with the smile she reserved exclusively for him. At 7, Charlotte was all dark hair and serious eyes, with Sarah's delicate bone structure and her father's stubborn determination. The past 3 years had taught her to be cautious with her trust, but with Elliot, she remained completely open, completely safe. "Daddy." She launched herself into his arms with the enthusiasm that never failed to remind him why every sacrifice was worthwhile. "You're early. I thought we could have lunch together," he said, settling into the tiny chair beside her reading nook. "Just the two of us." Charlotte studied his face with the intuitive perception that children develop when they've learned to read emotions more carefully than words. "Are you sad about something?" The question cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. How could he explain that their quiet life was about to become the subject of international attention? How could he help her understand that strangers might want to ask her questions about her mother, her silence, her private struggles? "Something happened at work today," he said carefully. "I helped someone who needed help, and now a lot of people are talking about it." Charlotte nodded solemnly. "Like when I helped Emma when she fell down and everyone said I was brave." "Kind of like that," Elliot agreed, "but with more people talking about it. People we don't know." "Are you in trouble?" Charlotte's voice carried the anxiety of a child who had learned that unexpected changes often meant loss. "No, sweetheart. I'm not in trouble. but some people might want to ask us questions about our family, about Mommy, about things that are private. Charlotte considered this information with the gravity she brought to all serious topics. What kind of questions? Elliot thought about the social media comments he'd seen the reporters calling the school, the way strangers felt entitled to dissect their lives for entertainment. Questions about how we're doing since Mommy died. Questions about why you don't talk to everyone. Questions that might make you feel uncomfortable. I don't want to answer questions, Charlotte said firmly. I don't like talking to people I don't know. You don't have to, Elliot assured her immediately. Nobody can make you talk to anyone. But I wanted you to know that people might try, so if anyone you don't recognize tries to ask you about our family, you can tell them to talk to me instead. Charlotte nodded, then leaned against his side with the casual affection that never failed to ground him. Daddy, why do strangers want to know about us? The question highlighted the fundamental strangeness of their situation. How could he explain that their private struggles had somehow become public property, that their moment of connection with Raina had been transformed into entertainment for people who would never understand the real stakes involved? Sometimes when something good happens, people like to hear about it, he said finally. But they don't always understand that the people in the story might want to keep some things private. Like how I don't tell everyone about Mommy's letters. Elliot's breath caught slightly. Sarah had written dozens of letters for Charlotte to open at various milestones, birthdays, graduation, wedding day, the birth of her own children. They were stored in a box in Charlotte's closet, a tangible connection to a mother she was already beginning to forget. The letters were Charlotte's most precious secret, shared only with her father and the grief counselor who had helped them both navigate the first terrible year. Exactly like that, he said quietly. Some things are special because they're just ours. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful consideration she brought to all important decisions. Finally, she looked up at him with serious eyes. Are you going to keep helping people even if strangers want to ask questions? The question cut to the heart of everything. The viral video had transformed a simple act of kindness into something much more complex, but at its core, the choice remained the same. Would he continue to treat other people with dignity and respect, regardless of the consequences? Yes, he said firmly. Helping people is always the right thing to do. Charlotte smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something radiant. Good. Mommy always said helping people was the most important thing. The drive home was quiet, with Charlotte absorbed in a new library book, while Elliot wrestled with decisions that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. Raina's offer of professional assistance was generous and probably necessary, but accepting it would mean acknowledging that their lives had fundamentally changed. The alternative, trying to weather the media storm alone, seemed increasingly impossible as the scope of international attention became clear. Their apartment was a modest two-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to working families, the kind of place where children played in common areas while parents watched from lawn chairs. It had never been luxurious, but it was theirs, filled with pictures of Sarah Charlotte's artwork on the refrigerator and the comfortable clutter of a life built around love rather than appearances. As they climbed the stairs to their second-floor unit, Elliot noticed a man in an expensive suit standing near their door, checking his phone with the impatient air of someone unaccustomed to waiting. Mr. Barnes. The man looked up as they approached, his smile carrying the professional warmth of someone selling something. I'm David Walsh from Channel 7 News. I was hoping we could chat about what happened at the hotel this morning. Elliot instinctively moved Charlotte behind him, his protective instincts fully engaged. How did you get our address? Public records, Walsh replied smoothly, as if this were a perfectly reasonable explanation for showing up uninvited at someone's home. I understand you've had an extraordinary day. Our viewers would love to hear your perspective on how a simple act of kindness has captured the world's attention. We're not interested, Elliot said firmly, fishing for his keys while keeping Charlotte shielded from the reporter's view. I understand your reluctance, Walsh continued, apparently immune to rejection. But the story is already out there. Wouldn't you prefer to have your voice included in the narrative? I can guarantee we'll handle your family's privacy with complete respect. The promise rang hollow, especially given that Walsh had already violated their privacy by appearing uninvited at their home. Elliot could feel Charlotte pressing closer to his back, her silence now born of anxiety rather than choice. Please leave, Elliot said, opening their door. We have nothing to say. Mr. Barnes, just 5 minutes. I have some questions about your late wife's connection to Japanese culture, about how that might have influenced your interaction with Ms. Saito. The mention of Sarah hit Elliot like a physical blow. The idea that this stranger had researched his wife's background, that he was prepared to turn their private grief into public entertainment, made Elliot's vision narrow to a single point of rage. Get away from my door, he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made Walsh take a step backward. If I see you near my daughter again, we're going to have a very different conversation. He ushered Charlotte inside and locked the door behind them, listening as Walsh's footsteps retreated down the hallway. But the violation had already occurred. Their sanctuary had been breached, their privacy proven to be an illusion. Daddy, who was that man? Charlotte asked, her voice smaller than usual. Someone who asks too many questions, Elliot replied, moving to close the curtains. But he's gone now. As he helped Charlotte settle at the kitchen table with an after-school snack, Elliot's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Raina Saito's assistant. Ms. Saito would like to know if now would be a good time for that phone call. The media attention is escalating more quickly than anticipated. Elliot looked at Charlotte, who was carefully arranging apple slices in perfect rows, a ritual that helped her process stress and made his decision. Their quiet life was already over. The only question now was whether they would have help managing what came next. He texted back, "Yes, please call now." The phone rang within 30 seconds, and Raina's voice carried both urgency and compassion when she spoke. Elliot, my team has been monitoring the situation. There are reporters outside your apartment building, at Charlotte's school, and at the hotel. This is moving much faster than anyone anticipated. One of them was at our door when we got home, Elliot said quietly, moving to the window to peek through the curtains. Sure enough, he could see news vans beginning to gather in the parking lot below. I'm sorry, Raina said, and the genuine regret in her voice was unmistakable. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Elliot, I need to ask, are you and Charlotte safe where you are? The question highlighted how quickly their situation had deteriorated. In less than 12 hours, they had gone from private citizens to public figures, from safety to scrutiny. For now, he said, watching more vans arrive. But I don't think we can stay here much longer. My team has a secure location where you and Charlotte can stay while we develop a strategy for managing this attention. It's completely private, and there are security measures in place to ensure your safety. The offer was both generous and frightening. Accepting it would mean acknowledging that their situation had become genuinely dangerous, that the simple act of kindness that had started the day had evolved into something requiring professional protection. What would that involve? Elliot asked. A private car will pick you up within the hour. You'll be taken to a secure residence where you can think clearly without media pressure. My PR team will work on establishing boundaries around Charlotte's privacy while developing a statement that addresses public interest without compromising your family's safety. Through the kitchen doorway, Elliot could see Charlotte had abandoned her apple slices and was now standing at the living room window, watching the growing crowd of reporters with the focused attention she usually reserved for nature documentaries. "Charlotte," he called softly, "come away from the window, sweetheart." She returned to the kitchen with the careful obedience of a child who sensed adult anxiety without fully understanding its source. "Raina," Elliot said into the phone, "I need to ask you something directly. Why are you doing this? What do you get out of helping us?" The pause that followed carried weight, as if she were deciding how much truth the moment could bear. "This morning you gave me something I hadn't experienced in years, the sense that someone saw me as a person rather than a position or an opportunity. In my world, genuine human connection is rare enough to be precious. I want to protect that, and I want to protect you and Charlotte from becoming casualties of public attention you never sought." Another pause, and when she continued, her voice carried a vulnerability that made Elliot understand she was sharing something deeply personal. "I also know what it's like to lose people you love, and to have strangers think that gives them the right to your story. My parents died when I was Charlotte's age, and the media attention surrounding their deaths taught me how quickly private grief can become public entertainment. I don't want that to happen to your daughter." The revelation hung between them like a bridge across the years, connecting two different experiences of loss and the particular cruelty of having personal pain become public property. "I'm sorry," Elliot said quietly. "I didn't know." "There's no reason you would have," Raina replied. "But it's why I understand what you're facing, and why I have the resources to help you navigate it safely." Elliot looked at Charlotte, who was now building careful towers with her apple slices while stealing glances at the window. Outside, he could hear voices calling his name, reporters practicing their opening lines for evening news broadcasts that would dissect his life for audiences who would never understand the real stakes involved. "What do I need to know about this secure location?" he asked. "It's a private residence about an hour outside the city. Completely secure, fully staffed, and set up to accommodate families. Charlotte will have space to play, and you'll have privacy to think. Most importantly, there are protocols in place to ensure no unauthorized people can get near you." "For how long?" "As long as necessary. My hope is that we can develop a strategy that allows you to return to your normal life within a few days, but with boundaries in place to protect your privacy going forward." The normalcy she promised felt like a fantasy, but the alternative, staying in their apartment while reporters camped outside trying to shield Charlotte from invasive questions while managing media attention alone, seemed impossible. "Okay," Elliot said finally. "We'll accept your help." "Good. A car will arrive at your building's back entrance in 45 minutes. Pack whatever you and Charlotte need for a few days, but don't worry about anything else. We can arrange for anything you've forgotten." As he hung up the phone, Elliot realized he was about to cross a line that would change their lives forever. Accepting help from one of the world's most powerful women would create obligations and connections he couldn't fully anticipate. But looking at Charlotte, who was now trying to build bridges between her apple towers, while the noise from outside grew louder, he knew he had no real choice. "Charlotte," he said gently, "we're going to go on a little trip." She looked up with immediate attention. "Where?" "To a safe place where we can think quietly, while all those people outside find something else to talk about." Charlotte considered this information with her usual gravity. "Will the lady who speaks Japanese be there?" The question surprised him. "Why do you ask?" "Because you smiled when you talked about her," Charlotte said simply. "You haven't smiled like that since Mommy died." The observation hit Elliot with the force of truth delivered by someone too young to understand the implications of what she'd noticed. He hadn't realized that his reaction to Raina had been visible, hadn't considered that Charlotte's careful attention to emotional cues would have picked up on the connection he was only beginning to acknowledge to himself. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Would that be okay with you?" Charlotte nodded seriously. "If she makes you smile, she must be nice." As they packed their bags, Charlotte carefully selecting books and the one photograph of Sarah she kept on her nightstand, Elliot found himself thinking about the morning's conversation with Raina. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had revealed layers of connection that neither of them had anticipated. Now, as they prepared to leave their home under the protection of her influence and resources, he wondered what other revelations awaited them in the quiet space she was providing. The car that arrived was elegant, but understated the kind of vehicle designed to move important people without attracting attention. The driver introduced himself as Marcus and guided them through the building's service entrance with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. As they pulled away from their apartment complex, Elliot watched the reporters scramble to follow their news vans, forming a convoy that looked like something from a movie about witness protection. Charlotte pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar neighborhoods disappear behind them. "Daddy," she said quietly, as they merged onto the highway, "are we going to be okay?" The question contained all the accumulated anxiety of a child who had already lost one parent and learned that safety was never guaranteed. Elliot reached over to squeeze her hand, offering the only reassurance he could provide with complete honesty. "We're going to figure it out together," he said, "just like we always do." As the city fell away behind them, Elliot found himself moving toward a future he couldn't have imagined when he'd woken up that morning, to mop floors and fix broken things. Somewhere ahead, in a place designed to provide safety and space for thought, Raina Saito was waiting with resources and understanding that might help them navigate the storm that had engulfed their quiet life. But more than that, she was waiting with the possibility of connection that had been missing from Elliot's world since Sarah's death, the chance that two people who understood loss and silence might find something worth protecting in each other. The highway stretched ahead, carrying them toward whatever came next. The secure residence sat like a hidden jewel among rolling hills 40 miles outside the city, its Georgian architecture speaking of old money and older discretion. As their car wound through gates that closed silently behind them, Elliot caught glimpses of manicured gardens and walking paths that seemed designed for contemplation rather than display. Charlotte pressed her nose to the window, her earlier anxiety transforming into wonder at the sprawling estate that looked like something from her favorite fairy tale books. "It's like a castle," she whispered, her voice carrying the awe reserved for genuinely magical moments. Marcus smiled in the rearview mirror. "Ms. Saito thought you might like it. There's a library with a reading nook that overlooks the gardens, and the chef has been told to stock whatever 7-year-olds prefer for meals." The attention to Charlotte's comfort struck Elliot as profoundly thoughtful. In his experience, powerful people rarely considered children beyond acknowledging their existence, yet Raina had clearly given specific instructions about making Charlotte feel welcome rather than simply accommodated. The main house rose before them, with understated elegance, its limestone facade warm in the late afternoon sun. As they approached the entrance, Elliot spotted Raina herself standing on the wide stone steps, no longer the polished business executive from the hotel, but someone more relaxed, more real. She wore dark jeans and a cream cashmere sweater that made her look approachable despite the obvious expense of her casual clothes. "Welcome," she said, as they emerged from the car, her smile encompassing both of them, but focusing particularly on Charlotte. "You must be Charlotte. I've heard wonderful things about you." Charlotte ducked behind Elliot's leg with characteristic shyness, but her eyes remained fixed on Raina with the intense curiosity she reserved for people who intrigued her. After a moment, she stepped forward slightly and offered a small wave. "Hello," Charlotte said quietly, the word barely audible but representing a significant gesture of trust from someone who rarely spoke to strangers. Raina's face lit up with genuine delight. "Hello, Charlotte. I'm very happy to meet you. Your father told me you love books. Would you like to see the library?" The offer was perfectly calculated to appeal to Charlotte's primary passion while giving her a choice about engagement rather than imposing adult expectations. Charlotte looked up at Elliot for permission, and at his nod she stepped closer to Raina with tentative interest. "Does it have stories about animals?" Charlotte asked, her voice gaining strength as curiosity overcame caution. "It has stories about everything," Raina replied seriously. "Animals, adventures, magic, and families. Would you like to choose some books while your father and I talk about grown-up things?" The suggestion contained an implicit understanding that Charlotte needed agency in her environment, the ability to retreat into the safe world of stories when adult complications became overwhelming. Elliot felt another layer of appreciation for Raina's thoughtfulness, her instinctive recognition of what his daughter needed. "Can I take them to my room?" Charlotte asked, already warming to the idea of having her own space in this elegant sanctuary. "Of course. Mrs. Henderson, not your teacher, a different Mrs. Henderson, will show you around and help you get settled. She has grandchildren about your age, so she understands what makes children comfortable." As if summoned by her name, an older woman appeared from the house's interior, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and her expression radiating the kind of maternal warmth that immediately put children at ease. She wore a simple blue dress that managed to look both professional and grandmotherly, and her eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure as she looked at Charlotte. "You must be Miss Charlotte," Mrs. Henderson said, her slight Irish accent lending music to her words. "I've prepared a room just for you with a view of the gardens and a window seat perfect for reading. Would you like to see it?" Charlotte looked between Elliot and Raina, processing the social dynamics with her usual careful attention. "Will Daddy be here when I come back?" "I'll be right here," Elliot assured her. "Take your time exploring." As Charlotte followed Mrs. Henderson into the house, her small hand trustingly placed in the older woman's, Elliot felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that came with watching his daughter navigate new situations. She was growing braver, more willing to engage with carefully chosen strangers, but he remained hyper-aware of her vulnerability. "She's lovely," Raina said quietly, watching Charlotte disappear into the house's elegant interior. "You can see her mother in her eyes." The observation caught Elliot off guard, both for its perceptiveness and its gentle acknowledgement of Sarah's continuing presence in their lives. Most people either avoided mentioning his late wife entirely or spoke of her with the careful delicacy reserved for tragic subjects. Raina's matter-of-fact recognition that Charlotte carried pieces of her mother felt both natural and healing. "Sarah would have liked you," Elliot said, the words emerging without conscious thought. "She had a gift for seeing people clearly, for recognizing genuine kindness." "I hope I would have been worthy of her good opinion," Raina replied, her voice carrying respect for a woman she would never meet, but whose influence shaped the people she was coming to care about. They walked together toward a terrace that overlooked the estate's gardens, where comfortable outdoor furniture was arranged to take advantage of the view. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, creating the kind of perfect moment that felt borrowed from someone else's life. "I should apologize," Raina said, as they settled into chairs facing the gardens. "My security team has been monitoring the media coverage, and it's more extensive than I initially realized. We're tracking stories in 14 countries now, with more being added every hour." The number hit Elliot like a physical blow. The idea that his conversation with Raina had become international news felt surreal, as if they were discussing someone else's life rather than his own carefully constructed reality. "What exactly are they saying?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Raina hesitated, clearly weighing how much truth the moment could bear. The stories range from accurately reported to wildly speculative. The Japanese media is particularly interested because of the cultural exchange aspect, while American outlets are focusing on the class differences and viral nature of the interaction. Unfortunately, some of the international coverage has become quite romanticized. Romanticized how? There are already opinion pieces about the fairy tale aspect of our meeting, speculation about whether this is the beginning of an international romance, and some rather creative interpretations of the symbolism involved in our conversation. Elliot felt heat rise in his cheeks as he processed the implications. The idea that strangers were turning their moment of genuine connection into fodder for romantic fantasy felt deeply invasive, a violation of something precious and private. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You didn't ask for any of this attention." "Neither did you," Raina pointed out gently. "But we both chose to act with kindness and respect, and unfortunately, that's become rare enough to be newsworthy. The question now is how we manage the attention without losing what made the moment meaningful in the first place." Before Elliot could respond, his phone buzzed with a call from Veronica. He glanced at the screen with reluctance, knowing that whatever crisis required the hotel manager's attention would likely complicate their situation further. "I should take this," he said apologetically. "Elliot." Veronica's voice carried barely controlled panic even through the phone's speaker. "Thank God you answered. We have a situation here that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" "The corporate team arrived an hour ago, and they're demanding a comprehensive strategy for managing the media attention. They want to schedule interviews, photo sessions, and a full publicity campaign centered around your story. They're talking about book deals, speaking engagements, and licensing opportunities." The words hit Elliot like an avalanche of unwanted possibilities. The idea that his simple act of kindness was being transformed into a corporate marketing campaign felt deeply wrong, a commodification of something that had been pure and spontaneous. "I never agreed to any of that," he said firmly. I know," Veronica replied quickly. "But they're saying that your employment contract includes promotional obligations, and that refusing to cooperate could be grounds for termination. Elliot, they're talking about bringing in professional image consultants and media trainers. This has gone way beyond anything I can control." Across from him, Raina was listening with the focused attention of someone accustomed to navigating corporate politics at the highest levels. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she absorbed the implications of what Veronica was describing. "Put me on speaker," she said quietly to Elliot, who complied after a moment's hesitation. "Ms. Hale." Raina's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Raina Saito. I believe we need to have a conversation about the hotel's approach to this situation." The silence that followed was profound enough to suggest that Veronica was processing the implications of having one of the hotel's most important clients directly involved in what she had assumed was an internal personnel matter. "Ms. Saito," Veronica finally managed, her voice pitched higher than usual. We're simply trying to manage this situation in a way that benefits everyone involved." "I see. And in your professional opinion, forcing Mr. Barnes into a publicity campaign against his will benefits him how exactly?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Elliot could almost hear Veronica's mental calculations as she tried to find a response that wouldn't alienate either a valued client or corporate headquarters. We believe that embracing the positive attention could create opportunities for Mr. Barnes to advance his career within the hospitality industry, Veronica said carefully. This kind of visibility is usually quite valuable for professional development. Has Mr. Barnes expressed interest in such advancement? Raina's voice carried the kind of razor-sharp precision that suggested she already knew the answer. Well, not specifically, but then you're essentially holding his employment hostage to force participation in a marketing campaign that serves the hotel's interests rather than his own. The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, cutting straight to the heart of the ethical problem with the hotel's approach. Elliot found himself impressed by Raina's ability to dissect complex situations and identify the core issues with such clarity. Ms. Saito, with all due respect, this is an internal personnel matter. No, Ms. Hale, it's not. Raina's voice carried the finality of someone ending a discussion rather than continuing it. Mr. Barnes became involved in this situation through his interaction with me, which makes it very much my concern. More importantly, Meridian International Holdings has significant contracts with your hotel chain contracts that include specific provisions about ethical treatment of employees. The threat was delivered with elegant subtlety, but its implications were crystal clear. Elliot watched Raina deploy her considerable influence with the same precision a surgeon might use a scalpel, cutting away the hotel's leverage without apparent effort. We certainly don't want any misunderstandings about our employee relations policies, Veronica stammered. Excellent. Then I'm sure you'll have no problem agreeing that Mr. Barnes's participation in any publicity activities should be entirely voluntary, with no professional consequences for declining such opportunities. Of course, absolutely. We would never. Good. I'll have my legal team draft a simple agreement formalizing that understanding, just to avoid any future confusion. As Raina concluded the call with professional courtesy that masked absolute victory, Elliot found himself experiencing a mixture of gratitude and unease. Her intervention had clearly solved his immediate problem, but it also highlighted the vast difference in their respective abilities to navigate complex power dynamics. Thank you, he said quietly as she ended the call. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Raina replied firmly. What they were proposing was ethically questionable at best, and I have the resources to address such situations. Not using those resources when they could protect someone would make me complicit in the exploitation. The matter-of-fact way she discussed wielding millions of dollars in contract leverage to protect a hotel janitor from corporate manipulation spoke to values that went far deeper than business strategy. Elliot found himself reassessing everything he thought he understood about wealth and power and the obligations they created. The legal agreement will also include provisions protecting Charlotte's privacy, Raina continued. No interviews, no photography, no use of her image or story in any commercial context. That protection will extend beyond your employment with the hotel. How can you guarantee that? Raina's smile carried hints of steel beneath its warmth. Because Meridian International Holdings doesn't just have contracts with the Royal Grand Hotel. We have relationships with most major media outlets, advertising agencies, and public relations firms. When I explain that Charlotte Barnes is off limits for any commercial purposes, that message will be understood and respected. The scope of her influence was both impressive and slightly intimidating. Elliot was beginning to understand that accepting Raina's help meant entering a world where problems were solved through channels he could barely comprehend, where phone calls could rewrite corporate policies and reshape media narratives. There's something else we need to discuss, Raina said, her tone shifting to something more personal. The international attention has attracted some rather intense interest from various parties. My security team has identified at least 3 separate groups of photographers who have been attempting to locate you and Charlotte, including some who specialize in more invasive tactics. The information sent a chill through Elliot's chest. The idea that people might be actively hunting for Charlotte, seeking to photograph her without permission for commercial purposes, made his protective instincts surge with frightening intensity. What kind of invasive tactics, long-range photography surveillance of schools and private residences, attempts to cultivate sources among people who know your family? The kind of attention that celebrities learn to manage but which can be devastating for private citizens who haven't chosen public lives. Elliot thought about their modest apartment, about Charlotte's school, and the speech therapy sessions that were so crucial to her development. The idea that all of these safe spaces might be compromised by strangers seeking to profit from their story felt like a fundamental violation of everything he'd worked to build since Sarah's death. "How long will this last?" he asked. "That depends on several factors," Raina replied honestly. "How we will manage the narrative correctly, establish clear boundaries, and avoid feeding the speculation, the intense interest should fade within a few weeks. However, the story has taken on enough momentum that some level of public recognition may be permanent." The prospect of permanent loss of anonymity was terrifying. Elliot had built his life around the ability to move through the world unnoticed, to focus entirely on Charlotte's needs, without external scrutiny or judgment. The idea that every grocery store trip, every parent-teacher conference, every quiet moment might now be subject to public attention felt overwhelming. "There is one potential solution," Raina said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of a suggestion she wasn't sure she should make. "If you're willing to consider it." "What kind of solution?" Raina hesitated, clearly weighing her words with unusual care. "My estate in Kyoto includes a private residence that's been unoccupied for several years. It's completely secure, has excellent schools nearby that are accustomed to protecting the privacy of international families, and offers the kind of cultural environment that might benefit Charlotte's development." The suggestion hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. The idea of moving to Japan, of transplanting their entire lives to escape media attention, seemed simultaneously practical and completely overwhelming. "You're talking about leaving the country," Elliot said quietly. "I'm talking about giving you and Charlotte the space to decide what kind of life you want, without constant pressure from people who see your story as entertainment," Raina corrected gently. "The residence would be yours to use for as long as needed, with no obligations or expectations beyond allowing yourselves time to heal and grow." Before Elliot could respond, Charlotte's voice carried across the terrace from the house's interior, bright with excitement as she called out to him, "Daddy, come see the library. It has a ladder that slides along the shelves, just like in Beauty and the Beast." The pure joy in her voice reminded Elliot why every decision ultimately came back to her well-being. Whatever choices he made about their future would need to prioritize Charlotte's safety and happiness above all other considerations. "We should see what she's discovered," Raina said, rising from her chair with a smile. "Important decisions are always better made after proper exploration of magical libraries." They found Charlotte in a room that could have been designed specifically for her dreams. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls connected by an elegant sliding ladder that allowed access to the highest volumes. A cushioned window seat overlooked the gardens, perfect for reading in natural light, while comfortable chairs were positioned throughout the space to encourage lingering. Charlotte sat cross-legged on the floor in the center of the room, surrounded by carefully selected books that represented a sophisticated understanding of 7-year-old literary preferences. Fairy tales, animal stories, and picture books about friendship formed neat piles around her, while she held a particularly beautiful edition of a story about a little girl who could talk to trees. Mrs. Henderson said I could read any book I wanted. Charlotte announced, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that made every adult complication seem manageable. And she's making cookies that smell like Mommy used to make. The casual mention of Sarah struck Elliot with its naturalness. Charlotte was beginning to reference her mother with less pain and more celebration, integrating memories of love into her ongoing life rather than treating them as sources of grief. That sounds perfect, Elliot said, settling onto the floor beside her. Have you found any good stories? This one is about a girl who lives in a big house with gardens just like this place, Charlotte said, holding up the book about the tree-whispering protagonist. She learns to speak a special language that helps her understand things other people can't hear. The parallel to their own situation wasn't lost on any of the adults in the room. Charlotte had an uncanny ability to find stories that reflected her own experiences, using literature as a way to process emotions and situations that were too complex for direct discussion. That sounds like a very wise girl, Raina said, settling into a nearby chair with the ease of someone who belonged in elegant surroundings. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in languages that aren't made of words. Charlotte looked up at her with sudden interest. Like how I talk to Daddy without saying things out loud. Exactly like that. The best communication happens when people really pay attention to each other, when they care enough to understand what's being shared, even when it's not spoken directly. The observation contained layers of meaning that Elliot was still processing. His connection with Raina had begun with spoken language, but had quickly moved into something deeper, a recognition of shared experiences and values that transcended cultural differences and social barriers. "Do you have children?" Charlotte asked, with the directness that only 7-year-olds could manage without causing offense. Raina's expression shifted slightly, a shadow of something that might have been regret or longing crossing her features before being carefully contained. "No, I don't," she said gently. "But I've always believed that children are the most important people in any family, and that protecting their happiness should be every adult's priority." Charlotte absorbed this information with her usual gravity, then returned to her book with the satisfied air of someone whose world had expanded in a positive direction. As she read, humming quietly to herself, the adults exchanged glances that carried the weight of decisions being made without words. "The offer about Kyoto," Elliot said quietly, his voice pitched low enough not to disturb Charlotte's reading. "What would that actually involve?" "A traditional home with modern conveniences about 20 minutes from the city center. Beautiful gardens, complete privacy, and access to international schools that would challenge Charlotte academically while respecting her communication preferences. The local community is accustomed to international families and values discretion highly." Raina paused, watching Charlotte turn pages with careful attention to the book's beautiful illustrations. More importantly, it would give you both the chance to experience the culture that Sarah loved enough to share with you. Charlotte could learn her mother's language, understand the traditions that shaped her, connect with that part of her heritage without pressure or expectation. The suggestion struck Elliot as profoundly thoughtful. Charlotte knew fragments about her mother's Japanese background, but the complexity of their grief had made it difficult to explore that cultural connection without overwhelming emotion. The idea that she might learn about Sarah's heritage in an environment designed for healing and growth felt like a gift he hadn't known how to give her. "How long would we be talking about?" he asked. "As long as you wanted. A few months, a few years, permanently if you chose. The only requirement would be that you allow yourselves to heal and discover what kind of life you want to build together." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the library doorway, carrying a tray that filled the air with the warm scents of fresh-baked cookies and chamomile tea. Her timing suggested an intuitive understanding of when children needed comfort and adults needed a moment to process complex decisions. "I thought you might all enjoy a little something," she said, setting the tray on a low table near Charlotte's reading spot. "Miss Charlotte, these are snickerdoodles made with extra cinnamon, just the way you like them." Charlotte looked up with surprise and delight. "How did you know I like extra cinnamon?" "A lucky guess," Mrs. Henderson replied with a wink that suggested more preparation than luck had been involved. "Your father mentioned that your mother used to make special cookies, and cinnamon is often what makes them memorable." The thoughtfulness behind the gesture, the research into Charlotte's preferences, the deliberate recreation of positive memories. The careful attention to emotional comfort spoke to a level of care that went far beyond professional hospitality. Elliot found himself wondering how Raina had known to arrange such specific kindness. What insights into grief and healing had informed her instructions to her staff? As Charlotte settled into her cookie with the contentment of a child whose basic needs had been understood and met, Elliot's phone buzzed with another call. This time the caller ID showed the number for Charlotte's school, and his heart immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios involving reporters and invasive photographers. "Mr. Barnes," the voice belonged to Principal Davis, and it carried the careful tone educators used when delivering potentially concerning news. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but we've had some unusual developments today that I felt you should know about immediately." "What kind of developments?" "We've received numerous calls from media outlets, as you probably expected. However, we've also had 3 separate individuals attempt to gain access to our building, claiming to be relatives of Charlotte's, including one person who insisted she was Charlotte's aunt from Japan." The information hit Elliot like ice water. Sarah had been an only child, and her parents had died years before Charlotte's birth. The idea that someone was impersonating family members to gain access to his daughter made his vision narrow to a single point of protective rage. "Did they provide any identification?" he managed to ask. "They did, but it was obviously fraudulent. However, Mr. Barnes, these weren't typical reporters or photographers. These individuals seemed to have detailed knowledge about Charlotte's routine, her teachers' names, even some information about her speech therapy sessions. We're concerned that someone may have accessed confidential records or conducted surveillance of our campus." Raina, who had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm, immediately pulled out her own phone and began typing rapidly. Within moments, she was speaking in quick, urgent Japanese to someone who was clearly receiving instructions rather than engaging in discussion. "Principal Davis," Elliot said, "Charlotte won't be returning to school for the rest of this week. I'll call you when we've figured out our next steps." "Of course. And Mr. Barnes, we've already contacted local police about the attempted access. They'll be increasing patrols around the school and have advised us to be extra vigilant about anyone claiming family connections to Charlotte." As Elliot ended this call, he realized that their situation had crossed a line from media attention to potential safety concerns. The idea that people were actively researching Charlotte's routine impersonating family members and attempting to gain unauthorized access to her school transformed abstract privacy concerns into immediate physical threats. "My security team is already en route to the school," Raina said, ending her own phone conversation. "They'll coordinate with local police to ensure the area is monitored, and they're arranging for background checks on anyone who made contact with school personnel today." The swift, comprehensive response highlighted the resources at Raina's disposal, but also the seriousness of what they were facing. Elliot looked at Charlotte, who was absorbed in her book and cookie, blissfully unaware that strangers were trying to gain access to her private world through deception and manipulation. "The Kyoto offer," he said quietly. "Is it safe there?" "Completely. The estate has comprehensive security systems, and the local community has centuries of experience protecting important families from unwanted attention. More importantly, the legal framework in Japan makes it much more difficult for media outlets to engage in the kind of invasive behavior that's becoming common here. Elliot watched Charlotte turn another page, her small fingers careful with the book's beautiful binding. She looked peaceful, content, safely absorbed in a world where problems were solved through magical thinking and happy endings were guaranteed. The idea of uprooting her from everything familiar felt overwhelming, but the alternative, living under constant scrutiny and potential threat, seemed impossible. "If we went," he said slowly, "what would happen to our life here?" "Nothing that couldn't be resumed later if you chose. Your apartment lease could be maintained. Charlotte's school records transferred, all your connections preserved for when and if you decided to return." Raina paused, clearly choosing her next words with care. "Elliot, I want you to understand that this isn't charity or obligation. You and Charlotte have become important to me in ways I didn't expect. The offer comes from genuine care, not corporate strategy or media management." The admission hung between them with surprising vulnerability. Elliot realized that their morning conversation had affected Raina as profoundly as it had affected him, creating connections that neither of them had been seeking, but both were beginning to treasure. "Charlotte," he said gently, "can you come here for a minute? I need to ask you about something important." She looked up from her book with immediate attention, her intuitive understanding of adult emotional states clearly detecting the seriousness of the moment. "Are we in trouble?" she asked, moving to sit beside him on the floor. "Not trouble exactly, but some people are being too interested in our private life. It's making things complicated for us here." Charlotte processed this information with her characteristic gravity. "Like the man at our door? Yes, like that, but more people. They're bothering your school and trying to ask questions about things that aren't their business." "About Mommy?" The question cut straight to Elliot's deepest fears. The idea that Charlotte might be subjected to invasive questions about her mother's death, her grief, her therapeutic progress, made him want to find a place where she could grow up free from such violations. "About our whole family," he said honestly. "About private things that should just belong to us." Charlotte leaned against his side with the casual affection that always grounded him. "What can we do?" "Well, Raina has a house in Japan where we could stay for a while. A place where people would leave us alone, and you could learn about the country where Mommy grew up." Charlotte's eyes widened with interest. "Japan like in the stories Mommy used to tell me. Exactly like that. With gardens and traditional houses and all the things Mommy loved about her homeland." Charlotte looked at Raina with new curiosity. "Is your house in Japan like the places in Mommy's stories?" "Very much like that," Raina replied gently. "There are gardens with stone bridges and koi ponds, cherry trees that bloom in spring, and quiet places perfect for reading and thinking. It's designed for peace and beauty rather than business and noise." "Would I go to school there?" "If you wanted to. There are excellent schools that would help you learn Japanese while still studying in English. You could discover your mother's language at your own pace without pressure." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would fundamentally change her understanding of the world and her place in it. Finally, she looked up at Elliot with serious eyes. "Would you be happy there, Daddy?" The question revealed Charlotte's primary concern, not her own comfort or adventure, but her father's well-being. In 3 years of single parenthood, she had learned to read his emotional state with uncanny accuracy to prioritize his happiness as much as her own safety. "I think I might be," Elliot said honestly. "It would give us both time to figure out what we want our life to look like, without all this outside pressure. Charlotte nodded slowly, then surprised everyone by directing her next question to Raina. Would you visit us there, or would we only see you here? The question contained implications that made both adults pause. Charlotte had clearly recognized the connection between Elliot, and Raina had sensed that their relationship extended beyond the practical necessity of managing media attention. I spend quite a bit of time in Kyoto, Raina replied carefully. It's one of my favorite places in the world. If you were living there, I would very much like to visit, if that would be welcome. It would be welcome, Charlotte said with the authority of someone making official family decisions. Daddy needs friends who make him smile. The simple statement cut through layers of adult complexity to identify the essential truth underneath. Elliot did need connection, did deserve happiness beyond the careful maintenance of Charlotte's well-being. The fact that his 7-year-old daughter could see this clearly, while he was still struggling to acknowledge it himself, spoke to her wisdom and his own need for permission to imagine a fuller life. Then it's settled, Charlotte announced, returning to her book with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex problem through straightforward logic. As evening settled over the estate, they found themselves on the terrace again, Charlotte curled up in Raina's lap, as naturally as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. The trust she was extending to this elegant stranger spoke to something fundamental in Raina's character, some quality that children recognized instinctively as safe and nurturing. Tell me about the house in Kyoto, Charlotte said sleepily, her reading having given way to the comfortable drowsiness that came with feeling secure and cared for. It's called Kinkakuan, Raina said softly, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality that vouched for perfect bedtime storytelling. Golden Crane Cottage. It sits beside a small lake where white cranes come to fish in the early morning. There are gardens with different themes, one for each season, and bridges that cross streams filled with golden carp. Like in Mommy's stories, Charlotte murmured. Very much like that. Your mother would have understood the design immediately, would have known which paths led to the meditation gardens and which viewing points offered the best sunrise views. As Raina continued describing the house that might become their new home, Elliot found himself imagining Charlotte learning to speak Japanese while feeding koi fish, discovering her mother's cultural heritage in an environment designed for contemplation and growth. The image felt both foreign and perfectly right, like coming home to a place he had never been. His phone had remained silent for over an hour, the first break from constant calls and messages since the morning's viral explosion. In the peaceful bubble of Raina's estate surrounded by beauty and protection, it was almost possible to forget the chaos they had left behind in the city. But even as they planned for escape to Japan, Elliot knew that some fundamental shift had already occurred. Whether they stayed in America or moved to Kyoto, whether the media attention faded or intensified their lives, had been permanently altered by a moment of connection that had revealed possibilities neither of them had imagined. As Charlotte fell asleep in Raina's arms, her small hand still clutching the book about the girl who spoke to trees, Elliot realized that they were no longer just a father and daughter trying to heal from loss. They had become part of something larger, a family structure that included this remarkable woman who had seen them clearly enough to offer not just help but hope. The future that had seemed so uncertain that morning was beginning to take shape, built around connection rather than isolation, adventure rather than simple survival. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Elliot found himself looking forward to tomorrow with anticipation rather than anxiety. The decision to leave for Japan crystallized overnight, solidified by a 3 a.m. phone call that shattered the estate's peaceful silence. Elliot's phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, pulling him from the first genuinely restful sleep he'd experienced in months. The caller ID showed Charlotte's pediatric therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, and the late hour immediately triggered every parental fear he'd learned to carry. Dr. Chen. He answered quietly, moving away from Charlotte's sleeping form, curled up beside him in the guest room's king-sized bed. Elliot, I'm so sorry to wake you, but I felt you needed to know immediately. Someone broke into my office tonight and accessed Charlotte's files. They took photographs of her therapy records, her progress notes, everything related to her selective mutism and trauma recovery. The words hit him like physical blows. The violation of Charlotte's medical privacy felt more personal and devastating than any media attention could have been. These records contained the most intimate details of his daughter's journey through grief, her struggles to find her voice again after losing her mother, the careful therapeutic work that had helped her begin to heal. Did they take anything else? Elliot asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Just Charlotte's files. They knew exactly what they were looking for, which suggests this wasn't random vandalism. The police are treating it as corporate espionage or stalking behavior. Elliot, whoever did this, has access to information about Charlotte's vulnerabilities that could be used to manipulate or exploit her. Across the hall, he could see light under Raina's door, suggesting she was either working late or had been awakened by the same sense of urgency that had pulled him from sleep. As if summoned by his thoughts, her door opened quietly, and she appeared in silk pajamas and a robe, her expression felt immediately alert, despite the hour. "What's happened?" she asked, moving toward him with the swift purpose of someone accustomed to middle-of-the-night crisis management. Elliot quickly explained the situation, while Dr. Chen continued providing details about the break-in. The theft of Charlotte's therapeutic records represented a new level of invasion that transformed abstract privacy concerns into immediate threats to her psychological safety. "Dr. Chen?" Raina said, taking the phone with Elliot's permission. "This is Raina Saito. I'm working with the Barnes family on security matters. Can you tell me exactly what information was compromised?" As she listened to the doctor's response, Raina's expression grew increasingly grim. She asked specific questions about the security of the building, the timing of the break-in, and whether other patient files had been accessed. Her queries revealed a sophisticated understanding of information theft and its potential consequences. "We need to assume that Charlotte's therapeutic history will be public within hours," Raina said after ending the call. "Professional stalkers and unethical journalists use medical information to craft narratives that exploit children's vulnerabilities for emotional manipulation." The prospect of Charlotte's private struggles becoming public entertainment made Elliot's hands shake with suppressed rage. The careful work they had done to help her process grief and trauma could be undone by strangers who would sensationalize her silence and turn her healing journey into clickbait content. "How quickly can we leave for Japan?" he asked. "My jet can be ready within 4 hours, but Elliot, once we go, it needs to be a complete break. No communication with American media, no social media presence, no digital footprints that could be traced. We essentially disappear until the story dies down." The finality of what she was proposing hit him with full force. They wouldn't just be taking a vacation or temporary retreat, they would be abandoning their entire American life for an indefinite period, cutting all connections that could be exploited by people seeking to profit from their story. "What about my job, our apartment, Charlotte's school records? My legal team can handle all the practical details. Your employment will be protected, your lease maintained, Charlotte's academic records transferred securely. When you're ready to return, everything will be waiting exactly as you left it." But even as she offered these assurances, they both understood that some changes would be permanent. The innocence of their anonymous life was already gone stolen by strangers who saw their private pain as raw material for public consumption. Charlotte stirred in the bed behind them, her small voice cutting through their urgent whispers with sleepy confusion. "Daddy, why are you talking so early?" Elliot returned to her side, his heart breaking, as he looked at her peaceful face still soft with sleep and trust. She had no idea that strangers had violated her most private therapeutic space, that her journey through grief was about to become entertainment for people who would never understand the courage it took for her to speak even a single word. "Some people did something they shouldn't have," he said gently, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "So we're going to take our trip to Japan sooner than we planned." Charlotte's eyes opened fully, immediately alert with the hypervigilance that trauma had taught her. "Are we in danger?" "Not danger exactly, but we need to go somewhere safe while grown-ups fix the problems these people created." She sat up in bed, processing this information with her characteristic gravity. This morning, Raina's airplane is going to take us to Japan, so we can stay in the house with the gardens and the koi fish." Instead of the anxiety Elliot had expected, Charlotte's face lit up with excitement that caught him completely off guard. "Really? Today, can I bring my books?" "All the books you want," Raina said from the doorway, her voice gentle despite the crisis management happening around them. "And the house in Kyoto has a library even bigger than this one, with books in both English and Japanese." As Charlotte began enthusiastically planning what to pack for their unexpected adventure, Elliot felt a profound shift in his understanding of what they were doing. What had begun as escape from unwanted attention was transforming into something that felt more like destiny, a chance for Charlotte to discover her mother's heritage while healing in an environment designed for peace and growth. The next few hours passed in a blur of efficient preparation, orchestrated by Raina's staff. Clothes were packed, documents were secured, and Charlotte's precious belongings were carefully wrapped for international travel. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a breakfast that catered perfectly to Charlotte's preferences, while Marcus prepared the car for another discreet departure. As they prepared to leave the estate that had provided their first taste of genuine security, Elliot's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single photograph, Charlotte leaving her school the previous day, captured with telephoto lens precision that made his blood run cold. "They were watching her yesterday," he said quietly, showing the image to Raina, "before any of us knew how serious this had become." Raina's expression hardened as she examined the photograph. "Professional surveillance. This isn't opportunistic paparazzi behavior. Someone planned this systematically." The realization that Charlotte had been deliberately targeted, that strangers had been tracking her movements and documenting her routine, transformed Elliot's protective instincts into something approaching fury. But beneath the anger was relief that they were about to place an ocean between his daughter and people who saw her as a commodity to be exploited. The drive to the private airfield took them through countryside that looked impossibly peaceful in the early morning light. Charlotte sat between Elliot and Raina, chattering excitedly about the adventure ahead, while the adults exchanged glances that carried the weight of their shared understanding about what they were really fleeing. "Will there be other children in Japan?" Charlotte asked as they approached the airfield, where Raina's jet waited on the tarmac. "There's an international school nearby with children from all over the world," Raina replied. "Many of them speak multiple languages, just like you will once you learn Japanese. Will they understand about not talking sometimes?" The question revealed Charlotte's deepest anxiety about new social situations. Her selective mutism wasn't defiance or shyness. It was a genuine inability to produce words when anxiety overwhelmed her nervous system. Understanding adults had learned to accommodate this reality, but children could be less patient with differences they couldn't understand. The school has extensive experience with children who process the world differently, Raina assured her. They understand that intelligence and kindness come in many forms, including quiet ones. The jet was smaller than Charlotte had expected, but more luxurious than anything in Elliot's experience. The interior resembled a comfortable living room more than an airplane with plush seating, arranged for conversation rather than transportation efficiency. As they settled in for the long flight, Elliot found himself marveling at how quickly their circumstances had changed. 24 hours earlier, he had been anonymously mopping floors and picking up his daughter from school. Now they were fleeing the country on a billionaire's private jet, seeking refuge in a culture that held pieces of Charlotte's identity she had never fully explored. As the plane lifted off, Charlotte pressed her face to the window with wonder, watching the American landscape shrink beneath them. "Are we really going to live in Japan, Daddy?" "For a while," Elliot confirmed, "as long as we need to figure out what comes next." "I hope it's a long while," Charlotte said, with the certainty that only children could bring to major life decisions. "I want to learn to talk to the koi fish like Mommy used to." The casual reference to Sarah's ability to connect with nature in the gardens of her childhood struck Elliot with unexpected poignancy. Charlotte was unconsciously seeking connection with her mother through the landscape that had shaped Sarah's early years, looking for pieces of her parent in the culture that had been left behind when Sarah immigrated to America. "Tell me about Mommy and the koi fish," Raina said gently, settling into the seat across from Charlotte with genuine interest. She said they were very smart and lived for a really long time, longer than people sometimes. She promised to take me to Japan to meet them, but then she got sick. Charlotte delivered this information matter-of-factly, but Elliot could see the shadow of old grief in her eyes. The trip to Japan that Sarah had planned had been one of many future promises that cancer had stolen, leaving Charlotte with stories, but no tangible connection to her mother's homeland. "The koi in the lake at Kinkaku-an are very old and very wise," Raina said softly. "Some of them have been there since I was Charlotte's age. I think they would be honored to meet Sarah's daughter." The promise carried weight that went beyond simple comfort. Raina was offering to help Charlotte complete a journey that her mother had been unable to take, to provide experiences that would connect her to Sarah's memory in ways that transcended grief. As the flight progressed, Charlotte divided her time between looking out the window and asking Raina detailed questions about life in Japan. Her curiosity was infectious, and Elliot found himself learning alongside his daughter about customs, traditions, and daily rhythms that would soon become part of their reality. "Do people really bow to each other like in movies?" Charlotte asked. "Sometimes, but it's not like in movies," Raina explained. "Bowing is a way of showing respect and acknowledgement. The depth of the bow depends on the situation and the people involved. It's about recognizing the dignity in other people. Like how Daddy bowed to you at the hotel. Exactly like that. Your father understood instinctively how to show respect in a way that transcended language barriers." Elliot felt warmth spread through his chest at the memory of that morning conversation, the moment when formal politeness had transformed into genuine connection. The fact that Charlotte had noticed and remembered the gesture spoke to her careful attention to adult interactions and their emotional undertones. "Will I need to learn to bow properly?" Charlotte asked. "Only if you want to. Many international families in Kyoto blend customs from their different cultures. You can learn Japanese traditions while keeping the American parts of your identity that are important to you." The conversation continued for hours, with Raina serving as cultural interpreter and Charlotte absorbing information with the enthusiasm of someone whose world was expanding in exciting directions. Elliot found himself relaxing, for the first time since the viral video had exploded their anonymous life, watching his daughter's genuine excitement about the adventure ahead. Somewhere over the Pacific, Charlotte fell asleep curled up in her seat, with a book about Japanese gardens in her lap. The sight of her peaceful face free from the anxiety that had marked her features for months confirmed that they were making the right choice regardless of the circumstances that had forced it. "She's resilient," Raina observed quietly, adjusting a blanket around Charlotte's sleeping form, with the natural care of someone who understood children's needs. "She's had to be," Elliot replied. "Sometimes I worry that she's too adaptable, that she accepts changes that should frighten her because she's learned that the world isn't predictable or safe. Or perhaps she's learned that home isn't a place but a feeling of being understood and protected. Children are remarkably good at recognizing genuine care regardless of the circumstances surrounding it." The observation carried implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Charlotte's immediate trust of Raina, her excitement about this dramatic change in their life, suggested that she had recognized something essential in the woman who was reshaping their reality through sheer force of generosity. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elliot said, lowering his voice to avoid disturbing Charlotte's sleep. "Of course." "Why are you doing all of this? The real reason, not the public relations answer." Raina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the clouds streaming past the airplane window. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "When I was 8 years old, my parents died in a car accident. The media coverage was extensive because of my father's business connections, and for months afterward, reporters followed me to school, photographed me at my parents' graves, turned my grief into entertainment for strangers." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she revisited memories that clearly still carried pain. "My grandmother tried to protect me, but she didn't have resources or influence. I spent years learning to hide my emotions, to never show vulnerability in public, to treat every interaction as a potential threat to my privacy. It's a lonely way to live, and it's not a childhood any 7-year-old should have to endure." The confession explained so much about Raina's immediate understanding of their situation. Her sophisticated approach to media management, her instinctive protectiveness toward Charlotte. "I'm sorry," Elliot said quietly. "I can't imagine going through that as a child. It shaped everything about how I approach the world, but it also taught me to recognize genuine kindness when I encounter it, and to understand that protecting someone's ability to grieve and heal privately is sometimes the most important gift you can offer." She turned to look at him directly, her expression serious and unguarded. "Yesterday morning you saw me as a person who needed help rather than a business opportunity or a problem to be managed. That's rare in my experience, and it reminded me what human connection is supposed to feel like. I want to protect that for Charlotte, to ensure that she grows up knowing that kindness exists without ulterior motives." The explanation recontextualized everything that had happened since their first conversation. Raina wasn't just helping them escape unwanted attention, she was actively working to preserve Charlotte's ability to trust, to remain open to connection despite the violation of their privacy. "There's something else," Raina continued, her voice dropping even lower. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the daughter she never had the chance to raise properly, about all the experiences she wished she could have shared with a granddaughter who trusted her enough to be vulnerable. The implication hung between them like a bridge across loss and longing. Raina was seeking connection as much as offering it, looking for the family experiences that her own childhood trauma had made impossible. "Charlotte seems to have adopted you pretty quickly," Elliot observed. "Children are remarkably good at recognizing safe people. And I think she understands intuitively that I see her clearly not as a damaged child who needs fixing, but as a complete person whose current silence contains its own wisdom." As they flew through the night toward Japan, Elliot found himself thinking about the family they were becoming almost by accident. What had begun as crisis management was evolving into something that felt more like destiny, as if the viral video that had shattered their privacy had actually revealed connections that were meant to exist. Charlotte stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like koi fish, before settling back into peaceful dreams. The sight of her unconscious smile suggested that even asleep she was processing the adventure ahead with excitement rather than anxiety. "She's going to love Kyoto," Raina said softly. "There's something about that city that heals people who need to remember their own strength." "And us?" Elliot asked. "What happens to us while Charlotte is discovering her strength?" The question contained layers of meaning that neither of them was quite ready to fully explore. The connection between them was undeniable but complicated by circumstances, by the dramatic difference in their resources and social positions, by the fact that they had known each other for less than 48 hours. "We figure it out as we go," Raina replied honestly. "But Elliot, I want you to know that whatever develops between us, my commitment to Charlotte's well-being is unconditional. She'll always have a place in my life regardless of what happens with adult complications." The promise meant more than any romantic declaration could have. Raina was offering Charlotte security and belonging that transcended whatever uncertainty existed between the adults who cared about her. As the plane began its descent into Kyoto, the early morning sun painted the landscape below in shades of gold and green that looked impossibly beautiful after the stress of the previous day. Ancient temples nestled among modern buildings, while gardens and traditional architecture created patterns that spoke of centuries of careful cultivation. Charlotte woke as the plane touched down, immediately alert and excited to see their new home. "Are we really here, Daddy? Are we really in Japan?" "We're really here," Elliot confirmed, watching her face light up as she pressed against the window to see the foreign landscape that held pieces of her mother's story. The immigration process was handled with efficiency that spoke to Raina's influence and preparation. Within an hour, they were driving through Kyoto streets that looked like illustrations from Charlotte's favorite books about faraway places. "It looks like the stories Mommy told me," Charlotte whispered, her voice filled with wonder as they passed traditional buildings and perfectly maintained gardens. "Because your mother's stories were true," Raina replied gently. She was describing real places where real people live and work and find beauty in everyday moments. Kinkaku-an exceeded even Elliot's expanded expectations. The traditional house sat beside a lake that reflected the sky like polished silver, surrounded by gardens that seemed to flow naturally into the surrounding landscape. Stone paths wound between carefully placed rocks and precisely pruned trees, while wooden bridges crossed streams that murmured with the gentle sound of moving water. "Welcome home," Raina said, as they stood on the entrance path, watching Charlotte's face transform with delight as she took in the beauty surrounding them. "Home." Charlotte repeated the word, carrying new meaning, as she tested it against this landscape that connected her to her mother's memory, while offering space for her own growth. As they crossed the threshold into the house that would shelter their healing and transformation, Elliot realized that their flight from unwanted attention had become something much more significant. They weren't just escaping, they were arriving somewhere they were meant to be at a time when they were ready to discover what kind of family they might become when given space to grow without judgment or exploitation. The koi in the lake swam in lazy circles, their golden forms moving through water that had reflected the sky for generations. Charlotte knelt at the water's edge, whispering words too quiet for the adults to hear, but clearly meaningful to both the speaker and her intended audience. "She's talking to them," Elliot marveled. "Of course she is," Raina replied with a smile. "They've been waiting for Sarah's daughter to come home." The first months in Kyoto unfolded like pages from a story Charlotte had been waiting her entire life to read. Each morning she would wake to the sound of water flowing over stones and the gentle splash of koi surfacing to catch insects in the early light. By the time autumn painted the maple trees in shades of fire and gold, she was speaking Japanese with the natural fluency that came to children who learned through love rather than instruction. Elliot watched his daughter's transformation with a mixture of wonder and recognition. The child who had retreated into silence after her mother's death was finding her voice again in a language that connected her to Sarah's memory while creating space for her own growth. Her selective mutism hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something more intentional. She chose when to speak, and when silence served her better, wielding both with equal confidence. "Ohayo gozaimasu, koi-san," Charlotte would whisper to the fish each morning, her ritual greeting delivered with the solemnity of someone maintaining an important friendship. The largest koi, an ancient golden creature that Raina claimed was older than all of them combined, had learned to surface when Charlotte approached accepting offerings of special food with regal dignity. "She's teaching them English now," Raina observed one morning as they watched Charlotte conduct what appeared to be a bilingual conversation with her aquatic audience. "Yesterday, I heard her explaining American holidays to them." The three of them had settled into routines that felt both foreign and remarkably natural. Elliot had taken over much of the estate's maintenance, finding peace in tending gardens that had been cultivated for centuries. His hands, calloused from years of hotel janitorial work, proved surprisingly adept at the delicate pruning and careful placement that Japanese landscape design required. "You have a gift for this, Mo." Takeshi, the elderly gardener, who had been teaching Elliot traditional techniques, remarked as they worked together among the autumn chrysanthemums. "The plants respond to your attention as if they recognize someone who understands patience and growth." The compliment meant more than Takeshi could have known. For 3 years, Elliot had focused entirely on survival and basic caregiving, putting his own needs and interests aside to ensure Charlotte's stability. Discovering that he had talents beyond maintenance and repair felt like reclaiming pieces of himself that had been buried under grief and responsibility. Raina spent increasing amounts of time at Kinkaku-on, gradually shifting her business operations to accommodate what she claimed was a necessary focus on her Japanese holdings. Board meetings happened via video conference from the house's traditional study, while she conducted international negotiations surrounded by centuries-old architecture that lent gravitas to even the most mundane corporate discussions. "The irony isn't lost on me," she confided to Elliot one evening, as they watched Charlotte practice calligraphy at the low table in the main room. "I spent years building a global empire that required constant travel, and now I've discovered that my most important work can be done from the place I've always considered home." Their relationship had developed with the same organic inevitability as Charlotte's language acquisition. What had begun as crisis management and mutual protection had evolved into something deeper, more complex. They moved around each other with increasing familiarity, sharing household responsibilities and parenting duties with an ease that felt both surprising and absolutely right. Charlotte, with the acute emotional intelligence that trauma had taught her, seemed to understand the adult dynamics better than the adults themselves. She would casually include Raina in future plans, asking questions like, "When we plant the spring garden, will Raina-san help us choose the flowers?" with the assumption that the three of them were a permanent unit. "She's very subtle about it," Elliot mentioned to Raina one evening after Charlotte had gone to bed. "But I think she's matchmaking." "7-year-olds are rarely subtle about anything," Raina replied with amusement. "If Charlotte is matchmaking, it's because she recognizes something that the adults are too cautious to acknowledge directly." The conversation took place on the house's traditional veranda, where they had taken to spending evenings talking while Charlotte read herself to sleep. The autumn air carried the scent of chrysanthemums and the distant sound of temple bells, marking the passage of time in rhythms that had remained unchanged for generations. "What are we too cautious to acknowledge?" Elliot asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Raina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the lake where moonlight created silver paths across the dark water. When she spoke, her voice carried the vulnerability that had become increasingly present in their private conversations. That we've become a family without meaning to. That Charlotte has attached herself to me as completely as I've attached myself to both of you. That the boundaries between protection and love disappeared so gradually that I can't remember when it happened. The admission hung between them like a bridge across the last remaining distance. They had been dancing around the reality of their connection for months, treating their growing intimacy as a temporary arrangement necessitated by extraordinary circumstances. "I love you," Elliot said, simply the words emerging with the same natural inevitability as water flowing over stones. "Both of you. Not because of what you've done for us, but because of who you are when you think no one important is watching." Raina turned to face him directly, her expression shifting from vulnerability to something that looked remarkably like relief. "I was beginning to think you would never say it first," she replied with a smile that transformed her face from elegant to radiant. "I've been in love with you since that morning at the hotel, when you chose to see me as a person rather than a problem to be solved." The kiss that followed felt like coming home to a place he had never been, but had always been searching for. After 3 years of emotional, careful maintenance, allowing himself to feel joy felt almost revolutionary. When they separated, Charlotte's voice drifted from her room with the sleepy authority of someone who had been listening to adult conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. "Finally," she called out. "Now can we have the wedding in the garden with the cherry blossoms?" Their laughter carried across the lake, startling night birds and causing the ancient koi to surface briefly before returning to their eternal patrol of the depths. The wedding Charlotte had requested took place the following spring, when the cherry trees transformed Kinkaku-an into something that looked like a dream made tangible. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by the friends they had made in the international community and the staff who had become family during their months in residence. Charlotte served as both flower girl and unofficial wedding coordinator, having spent weeks planning details with the intensity she usually reserved for her most important books. She wore a kimono that Raina's grandmother had preserved for decades, its silk the exact shade of cherry blossoms against her dark hair. "Today I get 2 parents and they get each other," Charlotte announced to the assembled guests, with the satisfaction of someone whose long-term planning had finally come to fruition. "I think this is what Mommy wanted when she taught Daddy to speak Japanese." The observation, delivered with 7-year-old certainty, suggested that Charlotte had understood something about destiny and preparation that the adults were only beginning to recognize. Sarah's insistence on teaching Elliot her native language had created the foundation for everything that followed, as if she had somehow known that her daughter would need this connection to navigate her path through grief toward healing. Dr. Chen, who had flown from America to attend the ceremony, remarked on Charlotte's remarkable progress during the reception that followed the traditional Shinto ceremony. "I've never seen such complete transformation in a child who experienced that level of trauma," she told Elliot and Raina, as they watched Charlotte teach other children how to feed the koi with proper respect and ceremony. "She's not just recovered, she's discovered strengths she never knew she possessed." "Japan has been good for her," Elliot agreed, though he understood that the healing had come from more than just geography. Charlotte had found in Raina the kind of patient, unconditional acceptance that allowed her to explore her mother's culture without pressure to perform or prove her worthiness of love. More than that, Dr. Chen continued, she's learned to see her silence as a choice rather than a limitation. That's incredibly sophisticated emotional development for someone her age. As if summoned by their conversation about her, Charlotte appeared at their side with the particular expression that meant she had something important to share. "I want to show you something," she announced, taking Raina's hand and leading them toward the lake where the afternoon sun created patterns of light and shadow on the water. Near the water's edge, partially hidden among the reeds, sat a small shrine that hadn't been there the day before. Charlotte had constructed it with careful attention to both Japanese tradition and her own creative vision, using stones from the garden and flowers she had grown herself in a small plot Takeshi had designated as exclusively hers. "It's for Mommy," Charlotte explained seriously. "So she knows we didn't forget her when we found our new family. I asked the koi fish and they said she comes to visit sometimes when the moon is very bright." The shrine was beautiful in its simplicity, a child's offering to memory that honored both loss and continuation. Raina knelt beside it with the same reverence she might have shown a temple created by master craftsmen, understanding that Charlotte's gesture represented not just grief but integration of past and present into something sustainable and hopeful. "She would love this," Raina said softly, "and she would love knowing that you've learned to speak her language while finding your own voice." "Will you help me take care of it?" Charlotte asked. "I think shrines are supposed to be family projects." The word family hung in the air with the weight of official recognition. Charlotte was claiming Raina not as a temporary guardian or helpful adult, but as a permanent member of their reconstructed unit, someone whose presence was essential rather than convenient. "Always," Raina promised, and Charlotte's smile suggested that the answer had been obvious, but the asking had been important anyway. As autumn returned to Kyoto, bringing with it the anniversary of their arrival in Japan, they received news that the media storm that had driven them from America had finally exhausted itself. The viral video that had started everything was now buried under layers of newer scandals and more recent human interest stories, while the legal agreements Raina's team had negotiated had successfully established boundaries around Charlotte's privacy that would last well into her adulthood. "We could go back," Elliot mentioned one evening as they reviewed reports from Raina's American attorneys. "If we wanted to." The observation was theoretical rather than practical. Their life in Kyoto had become too rich, too complex, too fundamentally satisfying to abandon for the sake of returning to circumstances that had never felt as much like home as this place where they had discovered how to be a family. "Do you want to go back?" Raina asked. Elliot looked around the room where they sat, traditional architecture, enhanced by comfortable furniture, books in multiple languages scattered on low tables, Charlotte's artwork displayed alongside priceless historical artifacts with equal respect. Through the open screens, he could see the garden where he had learned to find peace in careful cultivation, the lake where Charlotte had discovered her voice again, the paths where the three of them had walked through seasons of growth and change. "No," he said with certainty that surprised him with its completeness. "This is home." Charlotte, who had been listening while pretending to focus on her homework, looked up with the expression that meant she had been waiting for this conversation for months. "Good," she announced, "because I already told my teacher I would be in her class next year, and I promised the koi fish I would introduce them to any babies we might have." The casual mention of potential siblings was delivered with Charlotte's characteristic directness, but it carried implications that made both adults pause. The idea of expanding their family, of bringing new life into the peaceful environment they had created, felt both natural and revolutionary. "Babies are a big decision," Raina said carefully. "Something that requires lots of discussion and planning." "I know," Charlotte replied with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to adults who were being unnecessarily complicated. That's why I brought it up, so you could start discussing and planning. That night, after Charlotte had gone to bed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully planted important seeds in adult conversations, Elliot and Raina walked the garden paths under stars that seemed brighter in Japan than they had ever appeared in America. "She's not wrong about the babies," Raina said quietly as they paused beside the shrine Charlotte had built for Sarah. "I always assumed I had missed my chance for that kind of family, but being with you and Charlotte has reminded me what I actually want from life." "What do you want?" Elliot asked, though her presence here her daily choice to build a life with them rather than pursuing the global business empire that had once defined her already provided much of the answer. "This," she said, simply gesturing toward the house where Charlotte slept, surrounded by books in 2 languages and dreams of fish who understood her secrets. "I want to wake up every morning knowing that the people I love are safe and happy. I want to watch Charlotte grow up confident in both her cultures. I want to have more children who learn kindness and resilience from their older sister." She paused, her voice taking on the vulnerable quality that appeared when she shared her deepest truths. "I want to grow old with you in this place that has taught us all how to heal." The future she described felt both impossible and inevitable. 2 years earlier, Elliot had been a widowed janitor focused entirely on basic survival and his daughter's immediate needs. The idea that he could build a life of such richness, such complexity, such joy, would have seemed like fantasy. "Sarah would have loved you," he said, the observation carrying more weight than simple speculation. "She would have loved knowing that Charlotte found someone who sees her clearly and accepts her completely. Do you think she would approve of what we've built here?" Elliot considered the question seriously, thinking about Sarah's values and priorities, her fierce protection of Charlotte's well-being, her belief that kindness was the most important human quality. "I think she would be proud that Charlotte learned her language and connected with her culture. I think she would be grateful that you protected us when we were vulnerable. And I think she would be happy that I found love again with someone who makes Charlotte feel safe and cherished." As they walked back toward the house, Charlotte's voice drifted from her room, speaking softly in Japanese to an audience only she could see. She was telling the story of their family to Sarah's spirit, reporting on koi fish conversations and garden projects, and the daily miracles of a life built around love rather than survival. "She talks to her every night," Raina observed, "keeps her updated on our progress. Sarah always said the most important conversations happen in languages that aren't made of words." Elliot replied, remembering his late wife's wisdom about communication that transcended literal meaning. Maybe Charlotte has found a way to maintain that connection while building new ones. 2 years later, on a spring morning that painted the cherry trees in shades of pink and white that looked too beautiful to be real, their son was born in the same Kyoto hospital where generations of local families had welcomed new life. Charlotte, now 9 and fluent in 3 languages, held her baby brother with the careful reverence she brought to all precious things. "His name is Kenji," she announced to the assembled family and friends who had gathered to meet the newest member of their unlikely clan. "It means intelligent and second son, which is perfect because he's already very smart, and I'm technically his big sister, but not really his first sibling, because I'm kind of the first child and the welcoming committee." The explanation, delivered with Charlotte's characteristic precision about complex family dynamics, reflected her understanding that their structure was unconventional, but no less valid than traditional arrangements. She had claimed her role as big sister with the same authority she had once used to claim Raina as a permanent family member. Kenji proved to be a peaceful baby who seemed to absorb the tranquility of his surroundings with the same natural ease Charlotte had shown for language acquisition. He slept to the sound of water moving over stones, and woke to his sister's bilingual lullabies developing from his earliest days, the sense that love came in multiple forms, and family could be created through choice as much as biology. "He looks like you," Raina said to Elliot, as they watched Charlotte introduce her brother to the koi fish with elaborate ceremony. "But he has Charlotte's eyes, the kind that see everything and judge nothing." The observation carried particular meaning given their family's foundation in acceptance of differences and respect for individual pacing. Kenji would grow up understanding that some people spoke more than others, that silence could be as communicative as words, that strength came in many forms, including the kind that allowed his sister to choose when and how to engage with the world. "Do you think we should tell him the story?" Elliot asked, as they watched Charlotte explain to Kenji's infant attention span how the ancient koi had been waiting decades to meet him. "About how we became a family. Every child should know their origin story," Raina replied. "But we'll tell him the true version about kindness creating connections that transformed into love, about how his father saw a stranger clearly enough to offer help without expectation of reward. About how that moment of genuine human decency created everything he takes for granted." 5 years after the viral video that had shattered their anonymous life and sent them fleeing to Japan, Elliot published a book about their experience. Written in collaboration with Charlotte, who was now 12, and possessed opinions about everything from international politics to the proper way to approach shy fish. The book told their story with honesty that somehow avoided exploitation. The Janitor's Daughter. A Family's Journey Through Kindness to Connection became an international bestseller, but more importantly, it became a roadmap for other families navigating trauma-cultural differences and the challenge of building authentic relationships in a world obsessed with surface appearances. Charlotte insisted on donating her portion of the royalties to programs supporting children with selective mutism, while Elliot and Raina established a foundation that provided emergency assistance to families fleeing unwanted media attention. The viral video that had once threatened their privacy became the foundation for protecting other people's right to heal without exploitation. "It's funny," Charlotte observed during one of the book tours that took them back to America for the first time since their dramatic departure. "The thing that almost ruined our lives ended up helping us find our real family." The insight delivered with the wisdom that comes from surviving genuine crisis and emerging stronger reflected her understanding that difficult experiences could be transformed into sources of strength rather than permanent damage. "Do you miss anything about our old life?" Elliot asked, as they walked through their old neighborhood, past the apartment building, where reporters had once camped, and the school where strangers had tried to gain access to Charlotte's records. Charlotte considered the question with her characteristic seriousness, looking around at streets that had once represented the entire scope of her world. "I miss thinking Mommy was the only family I could ever have," she said finally. "But I don't miss being sad all the time or feeling like we were just surviving instead of actually living." The distinction highlighted how far they had all traveled from the people they had been that morning at the Royal Grand Hotel. Survival had been transformed into thriving isolation, had become connection, and the simple act of speaking Japanese to a silent stranger had revealed possibilities none of them could have imagined. On their last evening in America, before returning to Japan, they had dinner with Dr. Chen, who marveled at Charlotte's continued development and the family's obvious contentment. "I've never seen trauma resolution this complete," she admitted, as they watched Charlotte and Kenji play together in the restaurant's garden area. "Charlotte has not just healed, she's used her experience to develop extraordinary emotional intelligence and resilience." "Japan has been good for all of us," Raina agreed. "But I think the real healing came from learning to build a family based on choice rather than obligation, understanding rather than assumption. As they boarded the plane back to Kyoto, Charlotte settled into her seat with a book written in Japanese, while Kenji practiced his first attempts at words in the three languages that comprised his daily environment. The sight of her children absorbed in learning, secure in their identities, and certain of their place in the world filled Raina with the kind of satisfaction that no business achievement had ever provided. "No regrets?" Elliot asked, as Japan's coastline appeared below them, the familiar patterns of islands and cities that had become the geography of their real life. "Only one," Raina replied, watching Charlotte point out landmarks to Kenji, as if he could understand her detailed explanations of their country's history and culture. "What's that?" "That it took a viral video and an international crisis to find you," she said with a smile. "But I suppose some love stories require dramatic beginnings to match their extraordinary conclusions." As their plane descended toward the airport, that would take them home to gardens where ancient koi waited for daily conversations with bilingual children, Elliot reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with a janitor speaking Japanese to a silent CEO had evolved into something that transcended the circumstances of its origin, becoming a story about the courage required to recognize genuine connection and the wisdom needed to protect it once found. Charlotte looked up from her book. As the wheels touched Japanese soil, her face lighting up with the smile she reserved for true homecomings. "We're home," she announced with satisfaction, speaking to both her sleeping brother and the country that had taught them all how to transform survival into joy. "Yes," Elliot agreed, taking Raina's hand as they prepared to return to the life they had built together through choice, commitment, and the daily practice of seeing each other clearly. "We're home." In Kyoto, the cherry trees were beginning their spring transformation, preparing to bloom in celebration of another year of growth renewal, and the kind of love that created families from the most unexpected encounters. The koi fish swam their eternal circles in water that reflected the sky, waiting patiently for the return of the children who had learned to speak their ancient language of patience, acceptance, and quiet wisdom. The story that had begun with a moment of kindness in a hotel lobby had become something larger than any of them could have imagined, a testament to the transformative power of choosing to see strangers as fully human, to offer help without expectation of reward, and to recognize that the most important conversations often happen in languages that transcend words. As they drove through the familiar streets toward Kinkakuan, Charlotte began planning the garden projects she wanted to complete before Kenji was old enough to help, while Raina discussed business decisions that would allow her to spend more time at home with their growing family. The life they had built together was both extraordinary and completely ordinary, filled with the daily rhythms of work and play, learning and growth, challenge and celebration that marked any family committed to supporting each other's becoming. The viral video that had once threatened their privacy was now forgotten by most of the world, buried under the constant flow of newer content and fresher scandals. But its real impact lived on in the family it had inadvertently created, in the love it had revealed, and in the understanding that genuine human connection could transform even the most chaotic circumstances into something beautiful, lasting, and true. At Kinkakuan, the ancient koi rose to the surface as their car pulled into the drive, as if they too understood that some homecomings were worth celebrating. Charlotte and Kenji would soon be at the water's edge, sharing stories about their adventure in the language of splash and ripple that connected all living things to the eternal rhythms of growth and renewal. And in the house beside the lake, surrounded by gardens that bloomed in celebration of another season of love, choosing itself again and again, three people who had learned to speak the most important language of all, the one that recognized the sacred humanity in every encounter, prepared to continue writing the story that would never truly end.